answering your biggest game dev questions today and hopefully having some fun. Before we get started, I wanted to mention that this week I'm going to be doing some live streaming for this Lego Ninjago game jam that's going on. Unity's having this game jam thing that they're doing, and I'm going to just make a game throughout the week. So every day, just come join me for a couple hours with me building it up and having fun with that. If you're already subscribed, you should get the notifications. If not, just make sure that you subscribe so you can come join us and have fun with that. See what kind of games we can build. All right, so let's get started, everybody. Welcome, Yori, Jason, and Andrew. Thanks again for joining us.
Hello.
Yori is a developer on Terraria, lead programmer, developer on Terraria, makes awesome games and working in Unity now too on some other projects. Andrew, it runs Infinity PVR with some of the coolest art you've probably seen on the asset store, like the Dragon Pack, and streams pretty much constantly doing his RPG game development. I was watching your stream again last night. I wish I could chat with you from my TV. It'd be a lot easier because I see it and I'm like, I want to send him a message real quick. I just want to tell him something, but I don't have a device around like, oh, here's especially when it comes to like tips. I'm like, I see you doing the code thing. I'm like, oh, there's a really easy way you could solve that. Like, all right. Yeah. I need to figure that out. And then Jason's story, I assume everybody on here who's seen my channel before knows and has seen. I had noticed earlier this week, Jason, you did a video on Charles's channel. It was a pretty interesting one, and it seemed really popular on data structures.
Yeah, that one's been a long time coming. It was it's a topic that's really hard to explain, so we were kind of hoping to give a soft introduction to some of the more I guess the lecture enterprise side of this topic, because there's no shortage of stuff on making games, but if you didn't come from a college programming background, a lot of the concepts, the terms, the names for things can be a bit alien, and so we're trying to sort of democratize some of those ideas. So I still think it might have been a little bit hard to grasp. I think we probably should have gone a bit more, break that down further. But if anybody did see that, let me know what your thoughts are, and we can figure out how to go from there.
I saw it.
I think people should go watch it.
Yeah.
You watched it, Andrew?
I watched it just about 20 minutes ago, 30 minutes ago, and I thought it was wonderful. It did a good job of bridging the very basics at the beginning to an advanced topic, or where I consider to be more an advanced topic at the end, where you get the data from and bringing it in from multiple sources, while also explaining that essentially use objects for this kind of data. And I thought it was a good pacing and very I guess the pacing was very, very good for the topic, I think.
Yeah,
all credit for that goes to Charles. Charles does the good presenter stuff far better than I do.
It was great that you mentioned the repository pattern in name for people to look it up later.
And it was an active decision to mention it last. I wanted people to go through the video, pay attention to the concepts without getting bogged down with jargon, and then at the end go, and there's a name for what we just did. You've probably heard it before.
Well, should we jump on to questions, guys? We had quite a few of them. Last week, I asked everybody who had questions to just submit them into the comments of the last video, and I saw quite a few of them come up, especially after I emailed everybody. Then they really started popping up. So we've got a bunch of them already ready. Are you guys ready to jump into them? We'll get started. All right. I think I'm going to start with just the first question that was on the list, the first one that got submitted, to just reward the first person, Jan Kubala, who submitted the question. And it was about behavior trees and finite state machines. So I'm going to read it off real quick and then we'll just talk about it. So it says, hi, I'd like to ask your opinion on using behavior trees, or FSMs, or the state machines, based AI for a stealth action game like Metal Gear Solid, for example. The action the AI does so far is patrolling, investigating suspicious activity, trying to fight the player using teamwork, and coordinating search for the player when they get away. I implemented a basic prototype using a state machine, but a lot of people tell me to use a behavior tree approach instead for a shooter AI. I'm familiar with the FSM approach, but I've not tried anything extensive with behavior trees so far. So I don't have the big picture, or I do not have yet have the big picture there. So I could probably redo the AI to behavior trees within a month, but would changing the approach to behavior trees really make further development easier for this kind of AI, or are those just behavior tree fanatics? Which I thought was the best way to ask the question. So I have some thoughts on this, but since I just read off the question, I figured I will let you guys share yours first. Anybody just thoughts, opinions on this? Would you switch
Um,
over to using behavior tree? Use a state machine? What do you prefer?
I'd say they answer completely different questions in terms of needs. A finite state machine is a graph that you traverse by seeing your current state and where do you go from here. And a behavior tree is a priority list of if you have these conditions, go and do that thing, regardless of what your current state is. They are completely different solutions to the same question. And I'd say that while state is nice to have and you can only do certain things while in a certain state, a behavior tree doesn't answer that. It says, what is the best thing I can do right now? Let me do it. And when you try and visualize it, instead of a graph where you only have limited paths to traverse, a behavior tree always gets to everything. Every moment you evaluate what is the best thing for you to do, and then you go for that. So in terms of trying to create something smart, I'd say always behavior tree in code. You don't have to actually go and make a completely behavior tree visualized implementation. It's just a question of, do you want to run code in a state or do you want to run any method at any time? Which I think we both know it looks smarter when you don't forget how to shoot if you're walking. So
No, I think that's a very fair argument. What about you guys, Jason? Your thoughts on this?
I guess for me, I look at it as state machines are internal decision making. So things can have a state machine and then be part of a behavior tree separately, right? Like it's kind of a weird thing to think about, but conceptually, they're not mutually exclusive or separate, and like was just said, they kind of technically serve different purposes. It's hard to give a direct answer because it really comes down to what you're trying to do. I will say though, hazard a guess, for most people in most projects, unless you are getting into really deep AI stuff, by definition, finite state machine is finite states, and you can probably get away with what you're doing. Like we're not all making Terraria scale multiple different things simultaneously, infinite amounts of complexity. A lot of people are just making like a thing that runs away from you or shoots you or does whatever. So I'd say evaluate what your goals are, and at the end of the day, you can start with a simple AI and then revisit it later. You don't have to know the answer straight away. I would say the correct answer probably is something more complex like a behavior tree down the line, but like I would say you can prototype most of what you're doing with a simple state machine. But again, I don't know the project. It's hard to tell.
Right. And well, the question starts off kind of mentioning that it seems like it works right now with the state machine. So there's probably not a big benefit
Yeah,
unless
I
there's
always favor
a
sticking
problem
with
you're
what
trying
works,
to
right?
solve.
If it works, it works.
Yeah. Once you hit a problem or you start to see that you're having a really hard time solving these problems and getting into different states or switching because of the transitions, or like I said, you walk and you can't shoot anymore and that becomes an issue, then maybe consider it. But I'd probably stay with where you're at right now. Behavior trees just kind of it's something that I know people who love them, who kind of love them. There definitely are some fanatics out there, but they're useful, but like everybody said, in some scenarios. What about you, Andrew? You use behavior trees or state machines?
I
Curious
think
what
I've used both without realizing it in the past. And so I don't really have a stake either way. My thinking is a month of dev time for something that is working just fine doesn't make sense. Changing something because it's the better way to do it makes sense if you have infinite time. But if it's going to take a month and there's no real benefit besides now I'm doing it the right way, if that was the right way, I don't see the immense value in that necessarily. So I think, like Jason was pointing out, figure out what the goal is, what you want out of it, and if it's working fine, don't change it. But if there is something that you can't do now that you could do otherwise, then evaluate whether or not that's worth the time. Or is there a different way of doing it, achieving the same thing, cutting a corner, who knows what?
That's a fair argument.
One thing I do want to mention before we move on to another question is that if you do want to stick to a finite state machine or a state machine, regardless if it has infinite states, one thing you can do is just give the states some data that other components can access. So even if you have a finding player state and running away from player state, you can still say you can shoot for these states, and then something else just handles the shooting. You gain some of the benefits. The decision making still isn't there, but you do have more functionality along the way.
Cool. So I think the next question I wanted to jump onto was the one that Jason had come up with a beautiful code answer to. And that was about modular code. And it came from Pikachu Fan 25. And it says, is making modular code a good idea? And if it is a good idea, to what extent can you explain some basic examples and some extreme examples to get an idea of when not to make it modular? So you actually put together a project and some code, and I've got it up right here. So let's make this nice and big. You're gonna just, I don't know. I don't know how you want to introduce this. So I
Yeah,
guess first you just had some thoughts on it. Is making modular code a good idea? Before we show the code, what's the answer to
yeah.
that?
So I would say the interesting part of the question is if something is too modular or not. Now, before I go down this rabbit hole, I understand what's really being asked here is it's like you can technically modularize things to infinity, and that can be exhausting, bad, and confusing, and that's entirely true. And if it's not adding value, don't bother. But I would say if that's the general idea, then there's already a problem because you're making things modular for no apparent benefit. So let's start with one premise before we even go down this rabbit hole. A module is a thing you need that you then, if you want to change it, you need something else. The old way doesn't support it, so you extract out the old one to put in the new one. So before we get to is something too modular or not modular enough, the question is why is it modular? If it doesn't need multiple variants, it doesn't need to be modular. So I'm going to show you an example that I actively did all possible modules I could think of just to prove a point. But I wouldn't ever do this because you don't just come up with just because you made a plug socket doesn't mean you have to make 500 things that plug into it just to prove the point. Once it's there, as requirements come up, you've allowed for that modularity, but you don't have to prove it with each case. So with that said, I don't think there is a limit on how modular something can get, because by definition, if you're doing modules correctly, you're modularizing to support requirements. Like by design, you're splitting out things as they need to happen. Now, the bit that there's a part here that I think people miss, and that's kind of what I want to do the example. So if you pop into the selector factory there, this should demonstrate the sort of the premise of what I was trying to get at. So here's me taking the concept of modularity to its obtuse logical conclusion, which is you could have a thing in a game, say an enemy, and you want it to pick targets. So it's going to attack targets. How does it pick targets? Well, in Unity, there's a lot of ways to select things. You can select things that you point at with the mouse, things you can see, things a character can see, things that are in a list, things that are casted. Now, casted could mean ray casted, line casted, sphere casted, box casted. It could be things that are multicasted, things that are ray cast all, multicast all, box cast all, whatever else. Then it could be things that are overlapping. Overlap sphere, overlap circle, overlap capsule, overlap whatever. Then it could be things that interact with the bounds. It could be on collision enter, on collision exit, on trigger enter, on trigger exit. Or it could be any other combination of them, like a personal set of filters where you just detect a set of things, like things that are near me, things that are far away from me, things I can see, things within dot product range. There is an infinite combination of things that end up with a selection. And if you go into the selector, just the selector class there, at the end of the day, this is all that a turret/enemy really needs. You check around you. If there's candidate things that are found, give me the things you found. And then you can query that and say, give me the ones you found which have this interface type or this class type on them. And then some way to draw whatever debug you're doing. Now, this example isn't fully fleshed out with a nice fancy editor like I would probably do, but hopefully you can see the principle here is that if I use this interface and said, select all things near me, get the ones which are type enemy or type NPC, or character. If get all of type character, if character dot allegiance is equal to not mine, shoot it, right? It doesn't matter beyond that point how you do that selection. And so what I want to demonstrate is this isn't just modular in one axis, it's modular in multiple axes. So if you go to the selector factory, you can make selectors out of multiple things. And probably the simplest example is the idea of a caster. So you can select things by casting. And if you go to the caster itself, just the normal caster class, what's a caster? Well, a caster is a thing which checks if it hits something. If it hits something, it returns the hit that it hit. And if you go to the inheritors, you can see there's a number of potential casters. So 6 inheritors there at the top.
Yep.
So I made a bunch of casters. So raycaster is probably the most common example. And in this case, a raycaster checks if it hits something by doing a physics raycast and spits out the ray it hit. And then it does some drawing stuff, and even the drawing's modular. You could pass in potential different ways of drawing that change the color and change the style and use the gizmos or use the handles or use line renderers. I don't care. There's simply a way with which you can demonstrate how things are drawn. And then if you go back to caster, you can pick a different one, pick, box caster or something. And you see it at a conceptual level, the line of code isn't that different. It's just one thing. Do a box cast with these settings, result in some output. And there is some other details in there, but you'll basically see the general premise is I've abstracted the concept of things which cast into the scene. Now we get to the other part. If you go back to selector factory, there's that type called casting selector. Where's the casting selector on line 47? So this is already an abstraction, a thing which casts, which could be boxes or lines or whatever, and it wants to result in a thing which selects. And so I use a caster to check if it casted against something. If it did, I get what it hit and returns that as a selection. So you can see this is turtled all the way down, right? I've gone from I want a thing to this thing requires a thing to make things. What things does it use? Well, things that get things, and I use that thing. And yeah, so this is really modular and separate and whatever. Now, here's step one. The question is this too modular? Whatever else. So you can basically prototype this, plug in different things, check for things near you, check for things far away, check for things you can see, do all of this. Now, here's the important part that people miss and people who complain about modularity don't understand. You can do this in the same way, like people who build hardware or people who have worked in any kind of fabrication, they'll tell you the prototyped 3D printed kits often have clickable parts. You can snap on, if you're building a custom controller, you'll snap on different handles, you'll snap on different modules, you'll take out different things during the prototype phase while you try out ideas. And then once you settle on the fabrication you want, you can make a hyper efficient version of it. For example, after all of this experimentation and all of these individual, super detailed, complicated, intermodular, whatever, when you're done, when you figure it out, you know what? Turns out a good old-fashioned raycaster actually works the best, but I want to raycast all things and get everything raycasted. You can go to Selector again, so go to the Selector interface. And at the end of the day, this is the contract you agreed upon. It's just when I ask you if you found things, tell me, and then give me the things you found, you can actually do inside of here the non-alloc, raycast, whatever, and then check that the returned IEnumerable is actually an array, and you end up with the efficient end result. You can do all of the modularity for the sake of experimentation without ever having to delete the code, making it very easy for you to change, and you can still end up choosing the high-performance solution at the end. So, to answer the question, is there such thing as too modular? No, because every time you do a module, you're actively saying, I want to try this thing. I want to plug in a new thing and see how it works. Maybe I want the old one, maybe I want the new one, maybe I want to combine them. And then when you're ready, when you figured out what you want, you can either pick the best of the choices, or you can make a brand new choice with all of your learnings. And that's what modularity gives you, the ability to plug in a solution, which could be none of the things you originally chose. You don't actually have to use the big chain of stuff. But this level of incrementing down will give you a lot of freedom to work with.
Very interesting. Yeah, wow. I did not expect you to say no. There's no, never too much modularity.
But again, that's why I caveat at the start with, if the question is, can I make this more modular? The answer is always yes, and then that's it. Don't do it. Don't just because you can do it. But if you're saying it does A, I want it to do B, So you draw a box around A, you make B. If you wanted to do C, D, E, F, G, and F, or Z, or whatever, you're the programmer. Of course, like, the answer is there too many features? Or is there a point where I shouldn't make the idea I have, is kind of what that sounds like. Like, you can always just say no, and then, or this isn't time efficient or worth it, or it's scope creep or whatever. But the answer is there ever too much? No, there's as many as you need, as much effort as you want to put in, as much as it makes sense, you know?
Yeah, I guess I've seen a lot of people over modularize things that they were never going to swap, though, quite a few times. So it's just one of the things you have to watch out for, that you don't end up spending 5 times as much time building a system that's a little bit less easy to work with for something you're never going to use. I mean, when you're going to use it,
I
it makes
100% agree. That's literally why, before I even looked at the
Yeah.
code, I made sure there's a PSA on what I mean by this is exactly this.
Yeah.
There's also one trapping with modularizing things that a lot of people miss, which is, do you make it harder for yourself to work with the system by modularizing it wrong? You should pay attention to what you actually need from a system as you try and make different things that plug into the socket, because if the socket is not fit for your task, you're going to end up just making everything harder for everyone. One task I had in the past where I had a bad starting point, I ended up having to debug in 3 different classes just to figure out what's going wrong, instead of just having one working solution that I can debug easily. So I'd watch out for that. Don't over modularize and separate things into small chunks if you can't trust that the chunks work right.
Yeah, and there's an easy trap to fall into with designing this stuff too, is if you are designing modules, you've already failed. If you're designing modules, you've gotten to the point where your code is going to be confusing, because you're trying to guess at hypothetical connection points for a hypothetical system. So, despite me saying there's no limit, I would also say don't actually try to design modules. Modules are a thing that happens as requirements change. So write exactly the code you need for exactly the problem you have, then step back, wish it has another different feature, draw a box around the one you have, plug in the new feature, draw a box around that, and then say, hang on a second, both of these things share something in common, still don't do anything, do a third one, and then all 3 of them go, oh, okay, so they all look like this, now you have a module. Modules are the end result of what happens when you happen to be doing similar or like behaviors. It's not something you plan for. So don't try to make things modular. Just if things look like there's sort of a place for things to change, be open to the idea of taking it out. And another way to put this is try to make non-destructive changes to your code. If you find yourself deleting an old function to put in new behavior, just pretend someone sneaks up behind you and says, hey, I want the old way again. Undo what you just did. It has to go back to the old way. And you're not allowed to cheat and just rewind your source control. The point is, you should be able to have a class you can swap out or a method you can swap out. So effectively, modules are what happens when you chunk out things so that they can be replaced or swapped. That's, by definition, the open-close principle. That's what you're doing.
Yeah.
I think it's all good advice. I wanted to jump on to another question that Yorai had pointed out earlier about the state machines and animator window, because I'm really curious what it was you had to say about it. It was something we kind of dove into before we went live and started streaming. The question was from Arcane Sin. Sorry, I'm pronouncing that wrong. It says, in what circumstances would you write your own state machine class and use an interface to add additional AI states as classes rather than using state machine behavior scripts in the animator window? And again, I'm really curious because state machine behavior scripts are something I've generally avoided. I've done a video about them, I think, once, but not something I actually realistically use ever. So I'm curious. Yeah, what are you thinking there?
So when we talk about the animator, you know that it's visual and primitive in the way that you only work by the parameter window. You can add basic booleans, basic triggers, floats, and whatever have you. But it's made for simplicity and mainly for animations rather than generic graph traversal. You can say that it wasn't, but if you're having code in your binding of things, you are losing the ability to look at your code. And when you make a state with a behavior that says, now I move to this, now I move to that, now I move to this, you're making everything harder for yourself to debug in the Animator window, and also you lose the ability to check states properly. If you make your own state machine, you can embed new conditions, rules, and personally fit bindings, so to speak, about what you need. Sorry, let me go a bit more concrete. One thing that you have in a state machine usually is, can I enter this state? And in the Animator window, all you have is state transitions. They have the conditions. You can't let a state decide if something can enter itself. It's only through the specific transition that you made from everything to anything. And those conditions can only work with the basics. But if you suddenly need a condition of, have I unlocked this specific thing in the game that I don't want to make 50 different booleans for? You don't have that if you don't have your own state machine. You can write any code you want in your own state machines, but you can't do that in the Animator window. And state machine behaviors are, they give you the entry points for most things, but they still don't give you the access to any arbitrary code. And you're going to end up with a lot of runtime bindings, which you don't want, just making everything harder for yourself if you use that. Generally, I'd say make your own state machine as soon as you see that you need some custom logic that won't fit in a basic member.
Yeah, that seems all right. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. One thing I wanted to point out is state machines aren't that big a deal to make. Like, I make them on a fly with 30 lines of code tops. So that's something that a lot of people fall to. You can make state machines with custom states too that have like whatever bindings you can dream up. I actually made one today where I made a pawn state that every time something is used in the state machine for the first time, it binds to a specific pawn in the game. And then it gets some members that the state can just use. So I don't have to start binding them dynamically and hope things go right. Because that's a performance cost that you'll pay if you have like 5 Animator state machine behaviors that all try to get a particle system. If you just need that particle system right now, you can just bind it to the pawn itself, and then the state machine can just get the pawn.
Another problem with using Unity-related systems like that is lifecycle control. Is you're handing over the entire control of when it's ran, when it's stopped, to the lifecycle that's Unity. And again, honestly, 90% of the time, that's fine. You probably don't need control. But if you're doing debugging, or sometimes it's just fun to have something where you can literally pause and step through it, or manually control the flow of your states by actively dilating your time or managing different things. And it's, yeah, sometimes it's useful just to have control over when a thing is ran as well.
Yeah, I'm just not a fan of those Animator ones in general. I've used them a little bit before, but I found kind of the same problems. I like writing my own, and I find it relatively easy to just write up a quick state machine, and then you can customize it and do whatever it is you need. I've done a bunch of videos on them in the past, and I'll probably do another state machine in the streams that I do this week too, just building one out.
One more thing I wanted to point out with the Animator state machine in Unity is that by the nature of having an animation clip slot in the Animator controller, you already lost because you know you're expecting an animation clip when a general state machine doesn't need anything. It just needs states. So you're using an implementation that's not meant for what you're trying to use it. And that's something that you should try and watch out for. If you're starting to use data that you don't need, or you're starting to use methods that you don't need, like with interface segregation, stop and try to simplify things.
Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention is there's the visual scripting system too. You could use that, the one that was Bolt and was bought out and is now in the package manager. You could use that to make a visual state machine too, and I think it's probably a slightly better option than using the Animator window if you want to build a state machine visually. That's probably the way that I would go. What about you, Andrew? You use either of these for visual state machines? You've used it in the Animator window or anything?
I have not. I actually tried once years ago when I had no business trying, and I failed. But I like the idea of having a little bit more control over these things, and I think that's one of the takeaways I'm getting here is that by using it, you are giving up some control, and you don't necessarily want that. And you know, when I think about AI stuff, one of the things I try to do is keep it as simple as possible. And with very simple AI, you probably don't need very complex code. So a simple script might work perfectly well. And I would always start with just trying that first. And if it works, if it's believable, if people are like, wow, AI is great, then stick with it, you know, and not make it too complex.
And that's actually one of those things which I think really people underestimate is AI as a result is a complicated concept. It's literally like behavior designing, and it can be very confusing and complicated. But I recommend for anybody who's new to just the general concept of AI is to look into a phrase called steering behaviors. And steering behaviors should realistically, if you're new to AI, blow your mind. It should be absolutely insane because steering behaviors really do separate the concept of something having a complicated result from a complicated calculation or behavior in terms of building it. There's nothing more insane and magical as a programmer to sit there and go, I write a line of code that says, go forward. Just do your best, keep going forward. And then write another one that says, if you see a thing you don't like, go away from it, leave, go in the other literally direct other direction, go away. And then write another one that says, if you see a friend, go join your friend. Those three little one-line statements of vector calculation literally move towards this vector. And then the crazy part, you stack all three together and you weigh them, which says, try to go forward with a strength of 20%, and then try to stick with your friends with a strength of 40%, and then 80% get out of there. Now, obviously, it'll average out and calculate. My point is, you put in these weights, then when something is moving towards it, without any control from you, it'll dodge around enemies and join its friends, and you'll be like, I didn't write that. I didn't write this smart thing that does all of this cool stuff. But that's what happens. So I wouldn't worry too much about systems and complicated designers and behaviors and whatever. At the end of the day, it's all logic, and a lot of it's simpler than you think it is. So you can make a really simple AI that feels intelligent by a combination of just knowing how things work. So look into Game AI by Example, which is a book by Buckland, and look into the entire Coding Train YouTube channel, and then the entire concept of steering behaviors. If you look into those three, you'll come away with a lot broader understanding that AI isn't as straightforward as which complicated architecture should I use to get my results, you know.
Yeah, and I guess
Yeah.
Sebastian's got some good steering behavior videos too.
What I like about that concept
Yeah.
is that you can easily add an additional thing. Like you can say, oh, if you get too far away from your starting position, suddenly that becomes a problem. So you want to go back or choose a new starting position. And you can just add these small little things that makes just a huge randomized, like suddenly, I don't know what it's going to do. You don't know what it's going to do, but it's only one of 5 things. It's just a really neat concept.
The most clever, simplest one of all time is the bouncing ball. People are like, do you remember those old DVD menus or the examples where there's a ball bouncing around the screen? That kind of looks like it has its own behavior. It's literally go forward. If you hit a bounce, flip the angle, go the other way. And by just doing that, it does all the bouncing and stuff by itself. Then, if you add the concept of gravity, which is literally just, you know, vector integration, you just say, apply a constant down. That's all you do. Whatever force you're going, just push downwards a bit at all times. All of a sudden, you'll get the ball that bounces and slowly slows down. That just happens. Like you didn't do anything. You just said, try to go, but let gravity weigh you down. And you'll realize all of these physics calculations, it's just a few lines of code. It's kind of crazy. So yeah, it's a really interesting topic.
Yes, definitely. There's also something funny you remind me of. When you have mistakes in those simple behaviors, people can suddenly think your AI is godsend and amazing because they do the most unexpected thing. They're so smart. And I remember a story, I don't remember where I've heard it, but somebody was making war fighter planes fight in a 2D game. And they would do this crazy dodging and people would try and replicate it for 3 hours, and then they didn't know how to make it work like that. The programmer who made it comes in and goes, "Oh wait, the X and Y axis are flipped." So you can gain a lot from very simple behaviors, especially if you make them unexpected. One thing I wanted to point out before we move to another question is, Jason, you mentioned using the visual scripting by Unity. Visual scripting is just visual scripting, so generally you can actually use that for state behavior too, because it's not traversing graphs for you. And I just wanted to point it out because that's an easy way to get a behavior tree visualized right there.
Oh, and actually, one other thing too, just because this is, again, love this topic. It's really interesting. This kind of branches from AI as a coding principle to AI as a design principle, but it's worth noting because I think people often miss this. Why are you making AI in the first place? Probably to interact with a player. And there's an old saying that it's not difficult to make perfect AI. It's really hard to make fallible AI because an AI can be easily given exact positions and coordinates and aim. The hard part is making it miss realistically in a way that's fair to the player. And with that in mind, whenever you're building AI, always think of the result, not just the code you're writing. For a really good example, I think this is one of the coolest examples of something simple, but it highlights this relationship. Slime Ranchers. Has anyone here played that game?
Yes.
It's really cool. It's just very simple, like farming. It's like Farmville with slimes. It's a cool little game. But the part that matters is there's a great talk by the creators. Like they've done 3 talks on GDC, I think. But the one that really stuck with me is they added a cat slime. So it's just a cat, and each slime has some unique behavior. Some explode if they're near other ones. Some, eat other ones. There's various different things. What the cat slime does, it's really simple. It's really simple, like AI behavior, which is if it sees food, it takes the food and it moves it to other places of food. So if there's a stack of food there and a stack of food there, and a cat sees food, it'll take it, skitter off somewhere, and then put the food down. Now, that's not a very intelligent AI. That's just a pretty straightforward if thing, pick up thing, move to other thing. But now look at it in the context of a game. So you're playing a game, right? And you see a bunch of slimes sitting there eating food. And you see a little cat run over and plop some food down beside it. And you're like, oh, look, he's feeding his friends. Isn't that kind of cool? But you could be watching, and then later on, you see a bunch of slimes eating food, and they're eating one piece of food. And then a cat comes over, takes the one piece of food out of their hands, and runs away. And you're like, that cheeky little, he just stole their food. And the thing is, this is all in your head as a player. None of this is coded as a intent behind the AI, but you are philosophically building these intentionalities behind these immersive elements. So AI doesn't have to be complicated in all cases. It has to come down to what the experience is for the player. And you can be amazed how really small behaviors can lead to very complicated and interesting designs. So don't always be too worried about it not being hyper complicated. Look at how it appears or how it feels to the player.
It's also about making the game feel good and not just making the AI have behaviors that you can interpret for yourself. It's about making the actual experience not destroy player enjoyment. And one thing that comes to mind as you talked about Slime Rancher is in Uncharted, all the enemies in the game will actually intentionally miss you with their first shot ever, so that you know where they are and you don't take the damage, and you feel like the fight is like a lucky shot, you had a chance, but yeah.
It's all good advice. Yeah, I think compositing up the AI like that into the fun experience is the most important part. There was another question I wanted to jump onto. I did real quick want to ask you about that mic, Yari. Is that the USB version of the microphone?
Yes. Is there any
And do
problem
you
with it?
like it? Because I've been considering. I think Salim needs one of those. It sounds pretty
Um,
good, so.
I'm very happy with it personally. I've only been using it in limited capacity in the past 2 days, but it sounds nice. It works nice. I didn't need much aside a stand for it.
Perfect. All right, I just had to ask. I was curious. It looked like it, and I've been looking at that for the last couple days, and had to ask now that I noticed it. So the question that I wanted to pop up next, actually I got reminded of because of this comment. It says, "I hate you, Jason, and other Jason, for getting me hooked on Writer, and now I have another subscription in my life." 2 things to note there. First off was that we are actually going to be able to start giving out some writer codes soon. I need to get back to them, but it's sounds like that's something that's going to be happening soon. So if you want to get a writer code, maybe in the next week for free for year one, maybe it'll be next week, maybe it'll be a little bit later. Make sure that you're subscribed and signed up so that you get alerted and know about it, because we'll do it live. And second was, there was a question about writer that came in from Phil Donahue saying, I'm finally giving writer a shot. As a Unity contractor, are there any concerns with collaborating with other developers that are using Visual Studio? Thinking of source control, project settings, etc. And also, are there any good writer plugins for Unity you would recommend? So, have you guys run into any issues using Writer alongside Visual Studio with Unity projects or other types of projects, or anything like that?
Yes, I actually have multiple things to say about that. I'll start by saying that Unity has integration packages for every IDE that you use, so make sure that you have all the integration packages for the IDEs your team uses. One thing that I like to do a lot when I start a new Unity project is I remove all the packages and dependencies I don't need, because there's a lot of stuff in there that's just slowing you down, like Unity Analytics and Unity Collaboration and whatever have you. And
it also has VS Code for every single project. Like, you make a brand new project, it just assumes I'm using VS Code. Why? Why do you assume I'm using VS Code in every project? Granted, it's not that much work. It's annoying to make. Yeah. If you're going to pick all of the editors out there, you just assume VS Code.
Yeah, so one habit I have is removing all these things like VS Code, Visual Studio integrations, because I've been using Writer for over a year now. And if I start working with someone else and those integrations are there, their thing isn't going to work. So be mindful of that. That's the first thing. Secondly, Unity actually has a specific writer attribute annotations. So you might get benefit out of it.
I hate that. So I was going to bring it up myself.
Yeah. So Unity lets you have these, and they only work in Writer. So pay attention to that, because you might get a benefit out of it, but the others don't. And if you make things in a way that depends on them, you're going to screw everyone else's speed up. So
can you give an example of one of those?
Jason, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so one of them, you'll probably have seen this. If you, every so often, you'll write something and Writer will say, hey, did you know you can put a handy dandy not null attribute on this so that your compiler knows in advance that it's not meant to be null ever? And that's cool. Like, there's reasons why that's valuable, but it's in a Writer namespace. You are now like intrinsically binding a piece of code to the editor you're using, which I absolutely hate as a principle. So I always ensure that's turned off. There's other ones
that's
too.
Only a compile time check, right? So does it cause Visual Studio to then fail to compile because it's not there?
I don't think it fails to compile, but I just don't like having using statements that integrate, even if they are stripped. The point is, it's adding it literally to the file itself. There is now an intrinsic actual assembly binding to that object.
Literally using JetBrains writer annotations or whatever it is.
That makes sense. It sounds like that one's to kind of sneak in a feature that's coming down the road in C#, right? The not null option. And trying to give you early access to that. Okay, what other issues? Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, one other thing that I find is a big one. This may sound kind of silly, but it is a concern. So long before there was Writer, there was Resharper. And Resharper was the big plugin that added all the cool features to Visual Studio. And there was a general advice to people where there's two kinds of developers. There's developers and there's power users. And power users would have a million super shortcuts and all this stuff, which made you 10 times more efficient when at your machine. But if you ever have to remote, or be it someone else's machine, or someone that says, hey, let's pair program this, and you're at their machine, you suddenly turn into a 10-year-old and you're like, I don't understand. How did everything work? And you slow down to like a comical level. And I've had both, and this actually goes for custom keyboards as well. I had a custom keyboard at one stage, which someone just couldn't type on. Not like they were slower. I mean, they would miss buttons because the layout was ever so slightly different and it had a row of command keys. Anything which causes friction between you and people you work with can be a real nightmare if your office is one where it's not as remote. So it really comes down to what you're doing. But I would say, just as a general rule across the board, regardless of editors or keyboards or whatever, every time you opt to take in something that is unique to your workflow, you are intrinsically binding yourself to it and giving yourself a harder time when you don't have that crutch. Now, I accepted that crutch with Writer, with Resharper I did, but I took the caveat that I used the Visual Studio themed shortcuts for Resharper. So at least the shortcuts are vaguely similar in a lot of cases. Then when I moved to Writer, I kept the same thing. So if someone's used to using Visual Studio and they use my version of Writer, most of the shortcuts work the same way. But
That's
yeah, in general,
I
just be
actually
careful
use
of
the
it.
Visual Studio. Sorry, I use the Visual
Yeah.
Studio shortcuts too. It's the default I've noticed when you install Writer
Is
now.
it? I th-
Yeah,
it
it
used to
goes
be
with
the
the
IntelliJ one.
Visual Studio. At least I just reinstalled it last week, and it was on there as the default setting. I was like, "Oh, interesting." I was like, "That's actually the setting that I like." So that's perfect. Yeah.
One more thing that is the smallest bit of friction ever, but it's worth mentioning, is you might have different settings in Writer for how you want your code naming to work. So you might say make all the Unity public fields actually write with Pascal case instead of Camel case, etc., etc. Writer actually has specific preferences for that, and it's going to start warning you when the other editors won't. And you might want to disable that if you're working with others who don't use Writer. Alternatively, you can try and figure out how those settings work and make them all match regardless of what project you're on. And the final smallest thing, and it's just IDEs in general, make sure everyone is on the same tabs and spaces, or your source control is going to have a lot of unnecessary swaps. I actually had a case last week or so where I saw a commit and there were like lines that didn't change, but they were marked as changed and they were pushed. And I'm like saying, oh God, it's just the replacement of tabs and spaces for 170 lines.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I've
that's a
seen
big
that
one.
before.
I've had that a lot, especially, and this is no offense to people like Andrew who work on Macs. It used to be, and this is kind of one of those interesting anecdotes, because there is a template inside of in the folder for Unity. So you don't really think about it, but when you say new C# file, it will it'll create a new file that uses the template that Unity has behind the scenes. Now, very clearly, whoever originally made it used a Mac to develop, and as a result, there was Mac line endings on that template file. And so every time you were in Windows using write a script, you get that yellow warning which says incompatible line endings. And that was because the template is a Mac template, even though it's a Windows build of Unity. And long story short, that gets to become issues. Now, source control, like if you're using something like Bitbucket and Source Tree combined or whatever, sometimes they'll actually automatically structure the line endings for you. But you can get into weird scenarios, just like we're describing, where somebody pulls out a project, makes changes to files, and when they save, it adds the line endings for their operating system at the end of the files. Then they push it, and someone else makes changes, and it adds the line endings for their operating system. And that's fine. That would not lead to any issues. You can have incompatible line endings across different classes. The problem becomes where if the source control on your machine is globally configured to fix the wrong line endings across your platform, you could both be fixing them back to all Apple or all Windows, which means if you change any file and make a commit, it'll commit every file as being changed. And suddenly trying to read your source code commit history is like, added a line of code, 4,000 changes. You're like, what? What is happening? So just be aware if you're working with multiple different platforms that you're configured correctly. And the last note on that is a lot of people put up with problems and they'll just leave them there and they'll kind of hack fix them as they go. For example, LFS being set up incorrectly and you're ending up with large files in your repositories. Sometimes people will just go, I'll fix it if there's a problem. Or meta files being incorrectly added or not added in certain cases and causing collisions. If you ever have those, don't let these fester. Stop, fix them before you move on, because they'll only get worse and they'll only get bigger and they'll cause. And even if it takes you 10 minutes or 5 minutes to resolve the issue, if you figured out, I just have to stash my changes, do this thing, delete these, why do that? Take the time once to fix it, because oftentimes it's just a configuration issue. So in general, just be aware of the things that differ across the team, fix the incompatibilities. You can often automate them, then get back to work.
100%. Actually, when we started with Relogic, trying to use Unity together, we spent a whole 3 days just trying to break how Unity works together and fixing those issues and learning how to fix them quick. We literally had intentional merge conflicts. We tried to make all the different file types and seeing if anything breaks the synchronization for source control, etc., etc. And we ended up with Unity git ignore file that supports what we need as a team, just to not have to deal with that with all our other prototype projects as we go on. Also, one note back, you mentioned Resharper. I actually have a funny little story about that. One time when we worked on Terraria 1.3, I think around 2015, we decided that it's about time to try and refactor a lot of the code because the game was built not with the intention of people ever seeing it. And it manifested with 50,000 lines main class and some other things. And we decided we need to clean this up. We need everything to be more consistent. Let's use Resharper. It's the best thing since sliced bread, everyone is saying. We let it refactor. 17 hours later, it was still not done. 17 hours that it was doing things, we couldn't see anything. The editor was busy doing its thing. And it slowed everything to a crawl. But after it worked, we had the biggest commit ever, which basically was your entire source code. Here you go. But it worked well, and I'm not complaining about it. I love Resharper and I love Rider. Great stuff for productivity all around.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Rider's been one of the best productivity improvements I've had. I mean, obviously not quite as good as this thing. I don't know if you guys saw this. The key that came, my copy and paste, nice and short. I still have no idea what I'm gonna do with this, but when I saw it, I had to get one. I was like, "That."
Make a
Wait,
game jam
I need
with
to take a
it.
tangent because I noticed this is one thing. Am I the odd one out here? Because after the conversation with Andrew, I need this solved. Am I the only one who uses cut and paste as regularly as I use copy and paste? Because it seems like everyone just copies and pastes. Because I'm confused.
I'm cutting a
I
lot.
only use cut and paste if I'm moving things to other files. Otherwise, I use Control Shift Alt and the arrows to just move stuff around. I used to cut and paste all the time until I got used to using that hotkey. Now I use that for the majority of my moves, except for if I'm moving things out of a path. So I'd say it used to be like 80-20, and now it's probably the opposite direction.
So the backstory there is Jason and I were talking, and he told me, he said, go ahead and cut that. And so I hit the delete button. And then he said, paste it. I was like, wait, but you told me to cut it. Because in my head, cut is the same as delete. Otherwise, I'm going to copy, then delete, then paste. I just add that step, and I don't know why. I must have learned it when I was like 5 years old or something. But I don't differentiate between cut and delete, where cut will also copy it. Yeah. Assuming that you're going to paste it somewhere.
Just like two hotkeys
so
in one.
I treat cut as like it's a separate like store over here. You just take it out for a second, clear your mind, and then put back the stuff you want. And if you want to go one step further, you can use Clipboard plugins. I use something called Beyond Compare, and it's a plugin that effectively it keeps a history. I have this, like, I can go back and I can see anything I've clipped for the whole day. And so if I'm working on code and I want to just take something out for a second, I'll just cut it out and then do some stuff, and I'll go, oh, I remember cutting a line. I can just go back through my history of clipboard stuff and then grab it back again. I don't do that all the time, but it's good to have if you're kind of like restructuring stuff and it's not just moving. If you're actively saying, I want to try something,
I think they added the clipboard history into Windows now. I think you might have to turn it on, but I'm pretty sure the history for your clipboard, there's actually, I forget the hotkey, like Windows C and Windows V or something like that. It'll pop it up and let you see the history of stuff.
Yeah, I've seen that before. I think it was like Alt Shift V or Alt. There was something there, but I don't like Windows one because in classic Windows fashion, they've hidden 3/4 of the features and just left it as this nice like floating window with 2 or 3 options. Beyond Compare is like, it's like the difference between screen capture and share X. One of them lets you take a picture and then you have a picture. One of them lets you take a picture and run macros, which can do a million different things. And so same with Beyond Compare. I find that a lot of the Windows default features don't have enough features, with the exception of multiple desktops. I've used third-party multiple desktop apps, and they're the opposite. They're too confusing. The default one in Windows is just 3 buttons. Everything you ever need for multiple desktops does the job.
Yeah. All right. I want to go ahead.
One last thing, devil's advocate here. Anybody using drag and drop instead of cutting and pasting?
Very, very rarely. On rare occasions, I'll find myself selecting some code and dragging it somewhere, but it's usually because my second hand is busy with something else. Like
in that
I've got
case,
a
anybody
kid I'm
use
trying to push off, or a dog I'm holding, or something, and I'm just trying to code with one hand.
what about drag and control drop? Does anyone else do that?
I
use
didn't
that
know that
all
was
the
a
time.
thing.
Yeah. If you drag and you hold control before you release, it's a copy, not a movement. There you go.
I do that in Unity a lot just to copy files.
Huh. I did not know that. Yeah, I've never done that. Learned a new trick. All right. Sweet. So I want to jump on to the next question, which was actually a code one, and it was one that
just before that, because we did go on I never actually got to finish there was also a question about plugins for Writer. We never actually got to suggest the plugins.
Any good plugins for Writer?
There is 2 that I use a lot. Well, there's 3 really. One of them, I think it's now either default or it's one of the recommended ones, called Heap Allocation Viewer. That's just really nice. It just has a little underline and says you're allocating stuff here. Just be aware of it. Then in terms of code cleanliness, 2 that I use a lot. There's one called cyclomatic complexity, and then one called cognitive complexity. And so they're just plugins, and they give you a nice little number over the top, and it'll either turn green, turn yellow, or turn red. If it's red, you've done something wrong. It's too complicated. If it's green, you're good. I can go into more detail about how it's actually a lot more complicated than that, and more importantly, how it's not just whether it looks nice, it's how it's mathematically less complex. But that will hopefully be a video on my channel whenever I finish the damn editing. So, so that's a different one. But those 2
I
are
think it's a
plugins
good video to do, but essentially it gives you a good idea of some bad spots or dangerous spots that are probably hard to maintain and harder to understand. It'll give you a real quick number and color. I love those cyclomatic complexity score things, because it gives you, when you get bored and you're looking for something to clean up and refactor, you're like, okay, well, oh, look at that number. That's huge. So I want to just take a look here. Give you something to do when you're not sure what you want to do. At least that's what I've always used it for. I guess, or finding that if I'm in something that looks terrible, thinking, okay, that I should refactor that. But I think I've gotten to the point now where I recognize it long before it gets there, and I'm like, I got to refactor this and clean it up. I hate super complex methods now.
What Don just said is super familiar. I'm definitely not the only one who finds that very relatable. Bloody Unity, that shortcut just kills me.
Does anybody use Control D to duplicate a file in Explorer and end up deleting it? Yes, I've done the same too. That's why I always have the recycle bin on, because I do that. Like, oh, let's duplicate that picture. Nope. All right, so go ahead. You have more?
2 things I wanted to say. First, in Writer, the heap allocation viewer and the cognitive complexity, while I 100% agree that you should use them, if you're just beginning to use Writer and things are still too complicated for you, or you haven't been programming as long and you've up Writer anyways, don't be afraid to turn these off if they feel like they're distracting you from your main goal, because the goal isn't to do that. It's to tell you, hey, if you're doing something important, we just wanted to let you know. But I found that someone who just used Writer for their first week, and I told them to enable these, they ended up getting so distracted by it because they never dealt with it, and it just wasted their entire week instead of doing what they wanted. So turn it off if it's not your point right now. And on Unity, you can actually change the hotkeys. So if you have this problem, I heavily recommend just trying to Control-J the duplication, because that's how you do that in Photoshop, and there you go, a convention that won't break your file saving tendencies.
Got to rebind.
Well, actually, again, this is because we're talking about Writer. There's just infinite amounts of these. There's another one too. This is another one for beginners, but also not for beginners, based on what you said. There's a point where you want to just learn the basics, and that's fine. But when you get past that point, but you're still a beginner, there's a plugin which will semi-regularly remind you when you do an action manually that has a shortcut to it. That's really cool. I still use it because there's so many things I'll do, and it'll just go, you could have just pressed this shortcut. That's a really cool one. And to kind of piggyback on that idea that sometimes Writer genuinely is just too complicated. There are 2 modes built in that people don't use, called Presentation Mode and Zen Mode. Zen Mode turns off all of the little highlights and pop-ups and blips and icons and whatever. So if you ever find yourself overwhelmed with Writer, you can just do it. It's Control T for me, but whatever your shortcut to bring up the helper thing is, and just write Zen Mode, and it will just give you this like cleaned interface where all of the little floaty texts and icons and stuff disappear. And then if you type Presentation Mode, it'll full screen the whole thing as this nice giant big editor with just some lines of text in it. And you can work with that and then undo one or the other. So I find I get a lot of joy out of just jumping into Zen mode when I'm like thinking ideas through, and I don't want like the feeling of 50 AI programmers making fun of all the little changes in my code. So that's a good one.
I'm a big fan of currently not using shortcuts because I'm still trying to force myself to type everything so that I learn it more. So especially I have a habit, as I'm sure many do, of copy pasting code that just works from another script and be like, oh, it worked over here, I'm just going to paste it over here, boom, it works. But I try, if I think about it, to retype it out just to get that muscle memory in, because otherwise I know I will. When I was doing web programming years ago, the connection to a database code, I never memorized that. I would always copy and paste from the very first one that worked to the very last one I ever wrote was just a copy paste of the exact same thing, just with slight changes. So
there's also the next step of training after that, where instead of starting to type them out again, you can start trying to see where do you refactor them to, so you don't repeat yourself.
Yeah, refactoring is a whole nother conversation.
And then you go after that and move to live templates. Then you move on to live templates, where you actually write a couple of your own shortcuts that auto-complete all of that code for you. But then we're getting into even further steps.
All right, so there are a bunch of other questions. I'm going to hit a couple of quick ones, and then I want to take some from chat too, so that everybody who's joining us here live can ask a couple things. One of the really fast ones was, hi, Jason, in a past video, you mentioned using link on the startup of your game, but trying to avoid using it during gameplay. I was just wondering if it would be cool to use it to filter your player's inventory. The answer is yes. Then I just wanted to clarify real quick. I don't avoid using it completely during gameplay. Just avoid using it during things that are in what we call the hot path, where it's getting called regularly. If it's getting called every frame, especially, or just consistently, then I'll avoid using link statements, especially if they're link statements that I know are actually allocating and causing problems. Usually what I'll do is run through and use the profiler. I'll look at allocations, look for any statements that I have, especially in areas that I know I'm using a link statement. I'll go through and make sure that that code's running, that I'm executing it, and see if it's actually allocating, see if I'm doing anything that I might have missed when I wrote the code. And a lot of times I'll think I'm writing something that's not doing something, and then run the profiler and find out, oh, it's doing something bad too, and one little change will fix it up. So I'd say don't avoid using it completely during gameplay. Just when you do, make sure that you profile it, make sure it's not allocating memory or causing burning a bunch of CPU cycles for no reason. What about you guys? I assume you generally agree with that one, or any other additional thoughts on that?
One thing that I make a point of doing is, if you're using a link statement like that, and you know there's a good chance it might be used in a hot path later, and it might be something you want to change, wrap it in just one layer of abstraction. So if I have something called products, rather than saying products.where price something something less than something something, where you'd have to use that line 4 or 5 times, and if you do change it, you have to change it in 4 or 5 places, have something on your products object called get affordable or get cheap or get for sale. And that way, inside of that, you can use a link statement. And if the link statement starts to become a bottleneck, you can switch it internally and everything gets the benefit from it, rather than having to go and change it later. So sometimes that one layer of abstraction can save you a lot of code changes later.
Yeah, I've been overusing link in my editor scripts recently, and I had to cache the values because I realized I was calling them just every editor frame, some of them. And, you know, in the editor, it's not so much of an issue, perhaps, but with enough of them, my scrolling frame rate was down to like 1 every half second or something. And so that was a problem. So the solution was just to cache them. And then I think that, you know, for a game where you're using link to load the inventory, something at load, that, you know, isn't going to be much of an issue. but you can also cache the results if you know the results aren't going to change. That you can then use that runtime too, which I think is a technique I'll use in the game. I'm definitely using the editor now as well.
And one of the most common use cases for link is actually to avoid returning too many things. There's two functions in link called skip and take. Skip skips X number of units, take takes X number of units. So if you want to say, there's like a really small little algorithm based on length divided by page size and the whole lot, where you can just say, take 10, skip 10 multiplied by my page number. So now it'll say, give me 10 at page X. And then as you increase the page, you'll get the next 10 and the next 10 and the next 10. And so you only have to work with, going forward, a smaller subset of data. So you can use, I'll often use link in cases like the example I showed you, Andrew, with the paginated editor. That's all that is. It's just a collection. Rather than populating all of them, I only take X at a time. And that way you can work on smaller units. So that's another way to avoid the link performance costs. It still has garbage. It's still going to go through all that. But in terms of the knock-on effects of rendering them and drawing them and doing all this stuff, that's actually faster to have a smaller amount doing that than to return a more efficient array, but then draw 200 items, right? So there's a trade-off there too.
You remind me a topic that I'm not sure if we want to open right now, but you can actually make your link faster if you do have to use it and you have big collections to iterate through. One thing that a lot of people don't know is that you can override an object's get hash code method and equality operators. And if you don't know what these are, I suggest looking these up because they can tremendously speed up how you make the comparisons and put things into dictionaries or hash sets for checking if they're there. Because when you want to compare objects, you actually have to start making comparisons for every single field in them. And if the fields are big or like constructed in some way that checks a lot of other things, you end up slower and you don't actually have to compare everything. You might only care about some fields or only care about certain small stuff. But mainly the get hash code method, if you don't write that one yourself, it's actually going to end up slower because I don't know the internals, but it ends up with an implementation that can be up to 100 times as slow as just you letting even writer auto-implement it.
And another part of that too is that when you return things as an enumerable, it could be anything, right? It could be a list, it could be a dictionary, it could be whatever. Well, not a dictionary, it'd have to be a key value, whatever. It could be any number of collection types that implement IEnumerable. But you can actually just cast it to the appropriate type if you know what it is. So if you follow a standard of using an array as your output type, you can actually just take the IEnumerable and check if it is an array and try to cast it to an array first and use the array rather than calling toArray, which will iterate the entire enumerable into an array. So funnily enough, the same line side by side, var results equals things.toArray versus var results things as array, is a vastly different performance because one of them is just getting it, one of them is building an entire collection by iterating every result. So this gets much more into the nitty gritty of when and where and how you know how to use it. But suffice it to say, yes, there are ways to make link more performant if you know what link is doing.
Cool. I think we hit that one pretty good. So the next one came from Troy D, and it said that game dev tools are growing more accessible, making it easier to make games, resulting in a rapidly growing indie dev population flooding the internet with games daily. What does this look like for indies for the rest of us in the 20s? Or I guess, yeah, or the 2020s. And to be honest, I've been seeing this, I think, since I don't know, the 2010 maybe 2012 or so, where the flood of games has just been nonstop and ramping up pretty consistently. I don't know that it's getting any worse. That it seems like it's relatively linear, that growth there, but it is big, and I guess it could theoretically be an issue as just more and more competitions there, and there are more and more people making games. Do you guys think that this will be an issue for people that want to make stuff and want to make games? Do you think that we'll ever have just too many games that just there's no reason to do it, or that it's just getting harder? Because I mean, obviously, I want to be real fair. When something new comes out, is the best time to jump on it. The first when the iPhone came out, is the best time to make an iPhone game. If you made an iPhone game in the first month, first year, you were pretty solid and you didn't have a lot of competition. Same with any new device that comes out. If it's a console and you can get on there quick, you've got a huge advantage. If it's a VR headset, an AR type thing, whatever the new thing is, if you can get in on it early, you have an advantage. But you guys think that it's like at a point now where it's an issue, or how do you guys feel about it over the next 8 years?
So I actually have a lot to say about this, but the most basic thing I want to ask you is to open this one link I sent, because it's already been talked about multiple times in GDC, and there's literally a term called indiepocalypse.
Yeah, I remember that from like 2014 or something.
So what I want to say is, as you mentioned, there is the concept of visibility for your product. And when there's a fresh market and there's nothing in it, every product is going to get visibility. However, as this market grows, a lot of fish enter the lake, so to speak, and you're just a small one compared to the big fish. So be careful about how long it takes you to make things, and if you can enter markets like that, because you can gain a lot just from the visibility. Right now, Steam used to have an issue where there were 80 game shaped objects released a day. There's actually a term that Steam themselves used, game shaped objects, because there were small games that took very little time to make. They weren't really about content, and they've been popped out for very small amounts of money. But it completely corrupted everyone's ability to find the good games, and you had to go through heaps of trash just to figure out, hey, this one game released a week ago. I've been following it for 5 years, but I didn't even know because the release link wasn't in my face. So stores are trying to make things work for that. If you can get any store to give you extra visibility, do that. There is a growing population of games, and they all compete for your attention. So it's going to get difficult.
I think I relate this to music. Is there too much music in the world? Music's very easy to make, very easy to record, but it still takes some amount of talent to make music that people actually want to listen to.
That's why nobody's made any good stuff since Tupac died, right? So yes, there is too much music. Okay, I think we've got the answer.
I think what happens though is you get this sort of a marketplace where yes, it's easier to make, but that means that there's going to be some really great content being made that wouldn't have been made if it was more difficult. But you're also going to get a whole lot of crap that you have to sift through. So you're going to get some markets that do really good curation, some markets that say, here's everything, have at it, take your pick. And you're going to find a lot of people who generally would be like, oh, I'm going to pump out stuff, won't find that rewarding. So even though it's easy to make crap, they're not going to be rewarded by producing crap, and they're going to move on to something else. So you'll end up getting some equilibrium of optimized marketplace dynamics, I suppose, in a very vague sense.
And to flip the coin on that, actually, because a lot of games, at least, start upping the standards because things are easier, you're actually required to learn a lot more just to compete with the very basic new things. So if a game that got really popular suddenly has gliding elements, now you have to learn how to add a gliding system and all the small dynamics of that. And, oh, your game doesn't have a gliding dynamic? Well, shame, I'm not going to try and play it. There's a lot of issues about this because games are expected to have more and more features. And if your game doesn't have them, well, you're going to run out of content quick. People are not going to be as interested. There's not going to be as much visibility because your game can't get covered by it. For example, there's a Twitter account about, do you have a dog to pet? Pet the dog. And Terraria didn't have that for years. And then we added a dog that you can pet. So Pet the Dog suddenly covered us. Small features, but you do end up having to spend more and more time just to compete with the other things in the element.
I'm going to throw a whole bunch of phrases at people now because there's a lot in this topic. The first one is one called the Eternal September. I don't know if how many people have heard of that phrase before, but it comes from the early Usenet days. And so let's pretend we're not talking about game dev. We're talking about anything, literally any industry. In my case, it was starting VR stuff. A friend of mine, it was modding in the Android scene. For other friends, it was whatever hobby or interest you're into. Um, it starts small. It has to. It's hobbies. It's like niche things, and over time it grows and gets bigger. And then as it grows and gets bigger, there hits a point where there's like a niche community of usually a few thousand people where everybody kind of knows each other or knows about each other. It's all about passion. You're only there if you actually sought it out and you really enjoy doing it. And it's not very popular, so you're not getting rewarded for your engagement. You're only being rewarded by the enthusiasm of your fellow fans. And that's great. But then at some point, it gains popularity. Something hits fame, and then there's an influx of new people. And what you don't realize is there's like a subtle language that happens in small communities. People are just used to being polite about certain things. You talk about certain topics. This is the way we speak to each other. There's buzzwords and like shorthands and glossaries of terms everybody knows. And then a whole bunch of new people come in and are like, hi guys, what's this mean? I don't know. How's this? Where does it go? And suddenly there's lots of loud noises. And it came from the idea of in September when new students would arrive on the local Usenets, and you'd have a whole lot of people who haven't been using the internet for the last year or so, and so they don't know the terms or the words or the phrases or how to do. So they're asking effectively the mundane questions. Or as we used to joke in the VR community, someone says, have you thought about making Minority Report in VR? It's like, yes, somebody brings that up every month for the last 3 years. So these kinds of things, because it's just what happens. Now, you can be angry at new people, or you can just accept the fact that that's the necessary part of things getting popular. So that's one. But it's worth noting that this has a bigger effect for you as a developer. So to bring this back to development, when you're part of a small niche thing, VR headsets, AR headsets, motion tracking technology, whatever it is that comes out next, whatever bandwagon you're jumping on, you will be part of that pre-Eternal September. And you'll have this like extra community that there'll be like dedicated members of companies that'll be there to give you free hardware and answer your phone calls. You'll have actual emails to direct people because that's how small it is. And at some point, they'll forget about you because Sony will jump on the bandwagon, and then it's part of the larger open scaled whatever. So as a general rule, if you join niche communities, you're going to have an easier time selling your product, working with people, getting an audience, all of that. And then once we start moving past that, we get into, well, how does it get bigger? Well, the term for that is democratization. And that basically means you take something hard to do and you make the tools so much easier that you don't need to go to college for 6 years to learn how to do it. And that's where GameDev has gotten. You don't need to even be a programmer anymore. There are games I guarantee you've played which are 90% written by non-programmers. For example, a lot of Hearthstone isn't written in code, dun dun dun, right? It's written using actually Playmaker, right? There's you non-technical from perspective people writing technical things. And that's really cool to learn with and gets you further along. But the trade-off to that is, of course, if you don't need to have that training, you often also don't need to learn the right way to do things. And that can be fine. As far as content goes, more content, the better. But this brings us around to the next thing, which is the Pareto Principle, or the 80-20 rule, which says that in anything that you're doing, 20% makes up the most of it, and 80% is the rest. For example, we talked about music. There's a lot of music in the world, but 20% of all music ever made throughout time represents like 99.8% of all music listened to, because we all know roughly the same artists. We haven't listened to every song ever made. And so when you jump into a large industry, you are part of that 100 bucket, and the chance that you're going to make it into that 20% is quite small. So you have to be realistic about the likelihood of your success relative to everybody else. And the reason people make it to that 20% is often stuff that you won't be taught. So because you have all of these tools, you can spin up Roblox and make games real quickly, or PlayStation Dreams, and you can learn really quickly how to like put logic together. But will anyone have actually taught you how to use leading lines or color theory, or how to structure a level, or how to make, like, for example, most people don't realize there is a difference between a problem and a puzzle. But like, these are terms in game design that mean different things. They actually fundamentally have different behavior designing for it. So these are the things that make the good versus the great, right? And so I guess I wouldn't worry about the 80% because that'll always exist. The more things get easier, the more people, the more bandwagon, the cheap crap will exist. It always will. But if you can ask yourself, how do you get out of that? How do you swim out of that into the smaller side? And it's because it's learning it's learning the craft more so than just the tools. And I think that's what's missing. Is if you care enough, if you like it enough, you will hunt out hundreds of hours of GDC talks. You will learn all of this really obscure stuff. And there's not going to be a straight line path. No one's going to give you a journey that starts you here and gets you here and now you're successful. there's stuff. And if you care enough, you'll go down the path, you'll learn more, you'll get better. And then over time, you'll just start producing stuff that's slightly better than the last stuff you produced. And if you keep doing that, you will be better than the average developer, and you will eventually get stuff that people like. So I wouldn't worry, is what I'd say. But at the same time, you have to be practical. So make it for fun, not for money. But if you enjoy it and you work hard, some people will eventually find your stuff and like it. The only last thing I would say is there's a gambler's fallacy problem here too, which is if you spend 10 years making your game and you put it out there, that's like rolling one dice and saying, I hope it hits jackpot or 6 or whatever I need for this. And then, like, if you don't, that's 5 years. Are you going to wait 5 years and roll one more dice? Or every 3 months, put out something, or every 2 months, or every month do a game jam, and keep rolling those dice until one of them is just unbelievably fun. For some reason, you've made 10 games in the last year, and this one that you didn't care about is like getting 10 times the traction of everything else. It may mean nothing to you, but you've found your answer. That's the thing. And then now you have better odds if you roll on that one. So take that, spend a year, make it much bigger, sell it, and you're more likely to succeed. So there's a level of pragmatism in it as well. It is a complicated topic, but I wouldn't worry about the other people and all of the other games. You're not up against 5 million Roblox games. You're actually up against what your real audience is and what kinds of games they buy.
I'm just
before
gonna
we
make a Flappy Bird simulator.
Before we move on to another question, I just wanted to point out 2 more things. One is that in the past, Steam, for example, didn't have a lot of indie games on it. They actually hand curated which games are going up on the store, and then we had the whole Steam Greenlight, and now there's a new system I forgot the name of, but it's even simpler. So a lot of games make it to the store without any complications. And getting all the extra features from Steam is fantastic. So if you're making a Steam game, definitely look into that. The entire community and the achievements, etc., is all really simplified, and it's just a package on Unity if you're using Unity to consume. And the other thing I wanted to say is, as Jason mentioned, if you make a lot of products and you find something that works, even if they're not the most impressive products, it's still valid. Nobody cares about your code except you, and maybe not even you sometimes. If you want to make a thing, it's what you want to make. The code is just a medium by which you do that. So don't pay too much attention for that. And I actually want to bring up one commendable case, which is, have you ever heard of Dragon Game? It's a game made by a single file. All the code is in one single source file, and it's public to see. And it's on Steam, and the game looks okay for its purposes. It's a commendable effort. There's not much to say against it, except, why are you doing this to yourself? But if somebody has the passion and they enjoyed what they were making, there's literally no problem with it.
Is this Dragon the game? Or a different one?
Let me just double check.
Yeah, I have to find it. I'm curious. I've seen some games that were built that way, though. My buddy Brad used to build his games that way. All of his games were a single code file. This one big giant file with methods. He never long down the road, I finally got him to start making multiple files and get into Unity stuff. But I remember all of his code was always in like one big file, and it was interesting stuff. Okay, yeah, let me pull this game up real quick and we'll share it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah, this is definitely a different one. There we go. Let's pop this up and show everybody the one you're talking about.
I think that's the one, at least.
A game about a dragon.
Yeah.
That's cool. Neat.
Simple, honest, can be fun. Nobody cares how the code looks. This is the game you're getting. You don't get the code. You don't get to see the code.
Yeah. Nice. All right, I wanted to jump on to a technical question while I've got my screen shared real quick and just answer it. It's a really simple one, but for anybody who's kind of new to programming or new to C# and Unity stuff, it might be kind of helpful. It was around a timer. Before we do, though, please, if you're watching and you're still live or you're just watching this later, hit the thumbs up button. Don't forget to subscribe. Later on this week, again, we're going to do a stream building out a whole Ninja game, or actually starting tomorrow, we'll be building out a whole Ninja game. So make sure you're subscribed and ready for that. Let's jump back now and go to the question. So this question came in from, I lost the name. Where is it from? Smith Trent 44. and it was using the new Unity input system, a simple bit of code that takes a player animation from walk to run if the axis input X is held for 2 seconds. So the goal here is if I hold it down or if I'm moving for more than 2 seconds, start running. Otherwise, do something else. So they've got some code here that says something like this is non-working code where the speed is greater than 3 and run is less than 3. Essentially, what they're trying to do here is wait for 2 seconds, and then after 2 seconds, kick up the speed. And here you can see on line 6, they've got a bit of code that reads to see if the axis input's x value is greater than or equal to time.delta times 2f. So they're trying to figure out how much time has elapsed. There's a couple issues here. First is time.delta is the amount of time since the last frame. So, I mean, that's the x-axis input's probably always going to be greater than that because your axis input's probably going to be 1, and the amount of time since the last frame is going to be 0.016 or something smaller even times 2. It's always going to be the case. What you want to do here is instead keep track of a timer for how long this is held down and then set that value up. And I wrote out a little bit of example code that doesn't deal with resetting it here right below, where you just essentially want to create a variable inside of your class. So this would be inside of a class, not inside the method, where you keep track of how long the button was held down for. Just called it held time. And then got an update method here where if the axis input is greater than 0, so if you're holding that x value pushing to the right, or what, I guess that's probably pushing to the right, then we increment held time by the amount of time that's past this frame. If you do this for updates over 2 seconds, then this line here will be true and speed boost will get set. Now, the one thing I would recommend to add on to this is that after, what is this, line 25, add an else statement that just sets held time back down to 0 because it's been released. And then that would essentially do it. And here you would put in your animator speed up code or whatever speed up stuff you want. And in the else statement, you'd turn that off. That's essentially how a timer works. And I know it's a little screen sharey, but I just kind of wanted to get into a quick technical one and answer that because I felt like it's something that people probably run into a lot and try to build timers all the time. You guys have any other thoughts on my little timer answer and example? And has everybody already hit thumbs up and dropped the link on Facebook and stuff?
The only thing I wanted to mention is that conceptually, the person was asking, how do I count time? And then they didn't have any code to count time. So try to figure out and reason what you want to do, and then make sure every task is ticked. And it's usually not going to be one line of code if you're trying to do 2 things.
And there was another question. Is it better to count up time instead of just storing time real time since startup? Now, I don't use the time real time since startup, but one of the things that I do use a lot of the time instead of counting up time is just a next time. So if I need something to happen every 2 seconds or whatever, when the thing happens, I will just cache the current time plus the delay as the next time and then just check time is greater than or equal to next time. I very rarely ever use the real time since startup. I just haven't found a big use for it. But I'm curious, what about you guys? Do you use real time since startup ever, or do you just use time.time?
I know. I use the I for the RPG I'm building. I do need to keep track of time, but I compute that myself just by adding, delta time essentially to a float, actually to a double, and then the benefits there is you can pause the game, you can slow down the game. So if there's some spell that slows time, you can just include that in the counter. So suddenly time is being tracked slower or more quickly. You can jump to various time points. You can do a lot more with it if you're tracking it yourself.
So you essentially have your own time class then, like your time manager that you're reading the time from and getting it from.
Yeah, and then if a bad guy has their next action is at a certain time, you can just compute what's the game time supposed to be at their next action, and they can say wait for that game time to hit, otherwise don't do your next action.
So there's 2 questions here. One of them was talking about time. I coming from the OG C# side of things, I don't like time.realtime since startup because at the end of the day, I'm more familiar with the date time class. There's literally a class in C# that says the current date and time based on the localization of the current device. And oftentimes, again, depends on what you're doing. But if it's a large enough scale of time, and we're not talking about seconds, milliseconds, or frames or whatever, I will just say, get the current timestamp right now as a datetime offset.utc or whatever. And then whenever I need to check it later, I will take the current datetime offset UTC now, subtract one from the other, and you're given a class called a timespan. And that timespan class lets you ask it how many seconds, how many milliseconds, how many whatever, and you get a lot more granular control. Obviously, that set of things is a lot clunkier than just a float. If you need just a quick calculation with a float, use a float. But if you want actual like detailed specifications of time differentials, that's the one to use. And then, to be honest, what kind of surprised me, I thought you would bring this up regarding the new input systems we were talking about earlier. You don't actually need to do your own timing logic for that at all. The entire point of part of the new input system is you can add bindings and modifiers. So you can actually make an action that's shoot, or you can make another action called held shoot or charged. And charged can be shoot with a modifier of a hold over X amount of time. And then when that input action fires, it'll fire only when that condition is met. So as for the first line of that question, I am using the new input system. The answer is don't make your own timers. Look into how to add modifiers to the inputs that you have to get the kinds of behaviors you want.
I'm actually going to give you a counter to that. Is this the responsibility of the input to affect the game logic, or is it the responsibility of the game logic to manage itself and you're just giving it the inputs? Because if you're saying there is an input action that tells me to make a charged shot, and suddenly you decide an ability gives you an instant charged shot, what happens? Because your input was the one declaring, hey, use the charged shot. So it's something that I didn't want to bring up because the problem isn't tied to the new input system. It's a problem of counting time and doing something unrelated to the medium by which you get the inputs.
Now, to be fair, to be 100% agree with you, I actually wouldn't. I've never used the hold function for exactly that reason. Almost every single time I've wanted to manage time, I like the freedom of tracking my own starting and stopping of an event, and I'll have the time, and I will like have multiple tiers of stuff, and when it hits certain whatever. So yes, even though I did just say that, I don't do it myself, but I think that's an architectural thing. If you're building a very simple game and you want to shoot something, and building a time loop and managing charged shots and then having to like what is the minimum amount of time held and min frame steps and stuff might be a bit much when you could literally just say add a hold 5 seconds if it's literally a game, like per what Jason said earlier about the Lego Ninja stuff. If you want a hold action, you don't need to manage time to have a hold for 2 seconds equals drop a bomb, right?
Yeah. Going back to the question about delta time versus real time in startup, I am 100% in the delta time camp, and I'm actually even going to say that if you plan to make a commercial game that's going to be turned on for the better part of a person's day, avoid time.time too, because after 9 hours, it actually loses a whole millisecond of accuracy. As with floating points, the numbers are approximated. It's just 4 bytes. It can't hold infinity plus 1 amount of time. And as the program runs longer, accumulated time structures will start to get inaccurate. And eventually, you can actually also hit a cap. I don't remember what's the exact one, but I think it's something like was it 97 days or something like that? Yeah, obviously, if your application has to run 97 days, you have other problems, bigger ones, but eventually you will end up with situations where things just stop working properly because time got too inaccurate. Delta time stays small, so it should be safe. And in Terra, we actually don't have anything that counts time to infinity. The best thing we have is a real-time wrapped hourly. We made sure that this time counter can never go beyond 1 hour. And we name it as such just so people don't make this assumption, because we actually had a bug with that for 2 years.
And for example, that's exactly why I prefer using something like taking a timestamp and then converting it to a Unix timecode or something. So something that I do a lot in projects is when you log in, I will take the datetime, the datetime offset.utc now.to Unix timestamp, and then I will take that and I will store that in player prefs as last logged in time. So the next time you log in, I can just compare it, get the same one, subtract one from the other. I have a time span thing. and I could say from days or from hours or from whatever, and say, oh, it has been literally 3 days, 4 hours, and 25 seconds since you last logged in. And then if you wanted to do whatever the classic, like some reward or something, you can do that. Although, as per advice in previous videos, if it's actual rewards in an actual game, you don't want to have that locally managed on account of the fact that people can spoof that. But that's a separate conversation. The point is, you can use that to stamp time in a way that has no running timers. If you're just literally saying how long has gone from A to B, just literally snapshot time and then check it again later, subtract one from the other. It's much easier.
Before we move on to any other questions, Vitorbs mentioned, so are you saying I should not use time to make a cookie clicker? And I just want to clarify, when you have a limited amount of data, bytes to store something, you're going to run out eventually. And if you don't manage and sanitize those 4 bytes that you get from time, well, you're going to start seeing inaccuracies if someone is going to play your game for very long. So games that stay up, either avoid time or start managing it yourself in some smaller, more concrete thing that you can control. So for example, you can say use delta time, accumulate the time, and then every second just put it in an int, seconds played, and reset to the delta time. You're going to stay relatively safe.
Yeah, and for cookie clicker, you have to do exactly what Jason was saying too, and save off that time using your time dot date or date time dot now or something. Grab the actual time of day and then restore based off of that. So there were another question, but that I wanted to ask for Andrew, but I'm not sure if he's still there or just frozen with his fingers on his.
Am I frozen?
Okay, now he's moving again. Okay.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah.
So this question was about items and item databases, and I was watching you working on exactly that yesterday. So I thought it would be perfect. When I mentioned I saw you on my TV doing a stream, you were doing item stuff, and I said if you were to create an item database using scriptable objects consisting of hundreds of objects, how would you handle accessing them in inventory? Hold IDs and reference an instance at the runtime, or what would you do? So would you just instantiate one or reference it? How do you manage that?
I am doing exactly that with the inventory and items modules that I'm working on. I'm going to be using my game. You'll be able to get them on the asset store too when I'm done with them. Unique IDs. That's the way I'm doing it. So the idea will be that each item is a scriptable object that has its immutable data that you can change at edit time, but you can't change at runtime. And then you'd have a runtime game object that simply has a field for the scriptable object that you can hold, but also a field for the unique ID of that scriptable object that you can serialize. You can save that. And so at the creation of the object or the creation, like when you're loading your game, you can reference the unique ID and then pull up the data from the scriptable object based on that. You would also need inside your game just a static object that holds all of the scriptable objects that you can just kind of iterate through and relink those. So you relink it at loading of your game, and then once it's there, it's there. But the UID, the unique ID, is the way you get around. For me, at least, for getting around tracking what's what and keeping that always the same. That also means you can then change the name of something. You can change the details of the item without actually changing the item object itself.
I think that makes a lot of sense. So you essentially have an item template or like the description of the item that's got like the icons, the stats or the default stats or whatever. And then you've got the other instance of it that's got your unique ID per instance. So you get 2 copies of a sword. They each have their own unique ID, and then that's also got data on like where they're positioned, right? Like what slot they're in or something else has a reference to that ID and the position to put them all back into place and rebuild the object when you kind of load into your game.
Yeah, essentially that. So all the unique ID refers back to the hard-coded data on the scriptable object. So no matter what you do in the game, you're always going to refer back to that data. If somebody saves their game, you change the code around and suddenly that sword is now, a dual sword or whatever you want to call it. They'll load up their game and their item will have its data changed because it's referencing this scriptable object. Unique data, let's say you have a craftable object system, that's going to have to live inside your savable code for runtime use, but always still can refer back to the hard data and rebuild any object based on the unique IDs attached to it.
And it's worth noting too that, so for people who aren't familiar with just IDs in general and the scaling those things up, the fact of the matter is IDs aren't special. You might have heard int IDs or GUIDs or other whatever. Forget about all the buzzwords and forget about what they don't mean anything special. All that matters is you have a thing, it has some information on it, and you want to uniquely identify this thing. Now, what identifies something? If you've got two people named John who are the same age, who have the same job, are they unique? Now, depending on the context of your experience, they might be or they might not be. The only reason you have IDs is because things change. For example, a lot of people might make the mistake of identifying something by its file location. It is this thing in this location, but locations change. And so you don't want the unique thing about this to be where it is, because where it is changes. So before we even go to what kind of IDs or how you use them, the reason you use them because an ID means it is a thing about this that isn't affected by what its name is, where it is, what color it is, what format it's in. And so that's the point of an ID. As for which ID to use or where you use it or how you deal with it, that's entirely arbitrary. You can use a number. Like at a very basic level, it can be 0, then there's 1, then there's 2, then there's 3. And that's perfectly fine in some cases, because you're basically saying, get me 5. 5 is this particular set of things. And you can literally change every other property of 5. It can change the name, change the job, change the age, and 5 is still 5. So everyone who's talking to 5 talks the same thing. The reason you don't do that is because if you have 3 people on different machines all playing the same game and they're making items and they press a button and it generates a new item, if the last item for everybody was 5 and everyone presses the button, they'll all make 6. And now you're getting into a weird scenario where there are 3 6s, which is the right 6. Now, the reason people use what are called GUIDs or UUIDs or whatever else you want to call them is they tend to be unsigned integers of like 128 bits. You don't need to worry about the math or the magic behind it. That's someone else's job. Suffice it to say, it's a randomly generated number that is mathematically improbable that it will match any other number, not just on your machine, on any machine everywhere. You could literally have millions of people all mashing the button, generating new IDs, and it's very unlikely two will match. It's not impossible. You can't actually say unique worldwide, but it's unique for all intents and purposes. And so that's what a GUID or unique ID actually is. It's just give me a number that is very unlikely to be any other number. And with that, you've got security that lots of people all over the world can generate stuff, and the IDs can safely be referencing the same objects globally. So the short answer is always use IDs if referencing something and it needs to be unique. But you don't have to be a big complicated super system. You only need that if it's like leaving your machine, effectively. Oftentimes it probably will, or you don't know if it will, so it's probably safe to bet in the favor of a randomly generated ID, but that's why it's there.
One more thing I wanted to bring up. The question seems to hint at the idea of holding the IDs and reference instance at runtime, so I just wanted to cover that. What Jason and Andrew covered is the serialization of the item into saving and then making sure that it is consistent across multiple loads of the game. But if you're just talking about making an instance and accessing the data at runtime, yeah, sure, use the reference flyweight pattern, and it's just an object somewhere in space that says this is what the item should be like. The IDs are there purely for serialization, which is a different topic. We did cover it in GameDev Show 28, where you want the serialization tips Jason mentioned around consistency and what Andrew mentioned about not letting things break. Regarding runtime overrides, if you say need to enchant a sword with fire, you still want to keep the original item and then have a set of overrides and make sure to serialize those as well, but they are not related to your unique ID. Maybe your enchantments have a unique ID, but that's another problem.
Yep. I forgot I was going to say something there, and I totally lost my thought. I think that's all. Yeah, just good advice in general. The GUIDs, by the way, I have seen a conflict once in a database. It's rare. It's one of those things that like you get a conflict when you hit certain scales, but it's extremely rare. And it came when I was merging game servers. So it was merging EverQuest 2 servers, and it used GUIDs for player IDs. And there was actually a conflict on player ID from one server I was merging into another, which was a totally actually it might have been just an item ID, not a player ID. But one of those, I think it was an item because it was something there was a lot more of. Um, yeah, it caught me off guard. I was like, "What the hell? This never happened
Yeah,
before." But luckily,
that's
it's
funny.
easy to update because it's just a database. Just write a little SQL statement there.
It's
But
also one item, right? Like it's not like you're getting thousands of different conflicts, right? And it's
yeah,
kind of fascinating because I was it almost feels like a shiny Pokemon, right? You're almost hoping that one day you'll see one out of sheer curiosity. In my case, I had when I was working for supermarket stuff, I was ingesting point of sale data from like 300 different stores over 6 years of unique individual per sales at the register for like 5-year history for each one of the stores. And I'm just like, come on, Collision. I'm just really curious. I want at least one of these to collide. And no, it never did. So
yeah, yeah. They're
Good for
definitely
them.
rare and easy to use. Cool. So are there any questions you guys wanted to jump onto? I've been kind of forcing on the questions that I wanted, and I wanted to see if you guys had any preference on the next thing that we ask, or if people want to just start dropping in some more questions and maybe pick from
Um,
there.
So there was one question by Arcane Sin, which asked, have you ever worked on a game that switched between a third-person controller and a VR controller? If not, what do you think that's possible? And if so, how would you approach switching between third-person controller and a VR controller in Unity? Now, this is a question that I can answer, but I know Jason has already solved that too. So here you go.
no, fire away. You can take
Okay.
this one.
So the question is if you can have a third-person controller and a VR controller, and there's actually a cheat that when working on VR, I know both Jason and I use, which is we don't use VR. The thing here is what plays your game should not matter. Your VR is just the thing that controls where the camera and the hands are. You can assign this task to anything else. So you can say this third-person controller is now what's active, and well, the hands of the character are controlled by an animator, and the camera is controlled by Cinemachine. You don't care. It's you assign the task to that, and if you want to take over in VR, just flip a switch. There you go. You're in VR mode. So it is possible. It should be relatively easy. There's not a lot of codes about which camera is active, which hands are in control.
Yeah, so there's the architectural answer, which is exactly that. It's like there's no distinction. If I have a car, a player, a tank, and a plane, the difference between me controlling one of them as a character controller versus the other is me pointing at which actor is active, right? I don't care. Like its input goes to something. That thing could be any one of these things. And so exactly the same, I would say if you're building a VR thing where you've got a bit that's first person, a bit that's third person, they're just different things that are turned on or turn off and handed various different connected inputs. To be a bit more charitable to the harder parts of that question, depending on the VR API you're using, you can get into some funky territory where if you turn off the VR camera or you do different binding things, stuff can go a bit wacky. It can sometimes not like when a controller disappears or certain things disappear. So I won't pretend that it'll be seamless every time. There's oftentimes very specific things you have to do to like another good example is with AR. There's like an AR camera that sees the world as like a live, always on camera. And it can get into some really weird territory if the camera's on behind your canvas and you leave it on, or you try to turn it off and turn it back on. It's not impossible, but there's just caveats occur. So I would say look into specifically whichever VR API you're using. It shouldn't be a deal breaker, but philosophically the general point is VR is just a camera and tracked positions. And if you can apply that to any input, it doesn't matter. It can control literally anything. but I will admit you probably have some hoops to jump if you're not familiar with the VR rig in particular. So get used to the rig, test out turning it off and on again, seeing what breaks, seeing what it needs, seeing what services in the scene talk to what. And once you have an understanding, you should just be able to literally like point the camera at something else or bind the inputs or whatever.
Oh, we were talking about this in the architecture Q&A for students right before this about asymmetrical VR stuff too. We're talking about the switching back and forth between like an in VR mode while you're actually playing, and then going into like a basically desktop mode, or even the asymmetrical games. Have you guys built anything like that where you're playing on the desktop and in VR at the same time, or maybe back and forth in a game?
I've done something a bit more limited than that, but I've made a VR game where you have a developer menu for spawning enemies and stuff all on the Unity UI window, just not in VR. So while I'm playing, I can just bring up the VR headset for a moment, click some buttons, and then I have something new to test out. That was the closest thing I have for that, at least.
Two things I made that kind of fall into that category is I worked on one project where it was like a horror game, and it was using the Steam VR SDK quite a while back, and the screen version showed you a kind of more top-down view of a map where you could see the person in VR in the horror experience, and you had information like when enemies and jump scares are about to happen, so you could brace yourself and watch the person about to freak out, and obviously they can't see any of the data, so that was fun. And at the time, that was just as simple as having a second camera, because if you have a second camera, it'll render differently, that was a cool inbuilt feature back then. And then a different one I worked on was for a company called Adventure Labs, and they do a escape room. And the escape room is a bunch of people in VR doing an escape room. And then the people at home could log in on a web page, and that web page was like the equivalent of a personal Twitch stream where they can see through the security cameras in the VR experience, and then put in commands and jump to different cameras and then look for codes and keys on the walls to guide the people in VR. So yeah, you can do stuff like that. That's usually pretty cool. If the question is how do you do kind of interesting stuff like that, I linked to one website there in the document, Air Console. Air Console is a cool little API platform that lets you do the equivalent of have you seen those You Don't Know Jack games where a bunch of people log in on their phone, they type in some passcode as part of the web browser, and then everyone's phone becomes an individual Unity application, and then you share a shared Unity application on the screen, and you can then have different controls and different interactions. It's actually really cool. You can basically make these kinds of games where people have their own, you have your own inputs and controls and like questions and pop-ups and touchscreen things for you, and then you can take turns passing it to people, and then it shows up on the screen. So if you are looking to try to make party games or social games, this is just an API. So you could literally do this and have a VR part of it as well if you really wanted to. But the core part is basically just a combination of JavaScript and Unity. So this is a fun way to build those sort of asynchronous style stuff.
Pretty cool. What does it run on the device? So here, I don't know how much you've used this, but they show it like people are playing basically on a TV from their phones. What's hooked up to the TV there? Is that like a
it
PC,
has been
or
a
are they
while. If I remember correctly, I have Unity app running on the phone, and then you navigate to a website on the page. The website runs a HTML5 canvas window, and then you can interact and send commands through the Unity app. And then I think, I could be wrong, but I think you can also have a separate web Unity application running as the host app on the screen. So, but for your case, it's just a Unity application on your phone. So that's what it runs as for you. And then the host app is just a series of APIs that handle the networking portion of shared data.
Then how does it get on your phone? Like, how do you get or on TV then?
On the TV, there's a web page. You go to a web page and you type. It'll give you a code to type in. So a code will appear on your device, and you register onto the. So you log into the page.
Needs to have a browser working then.
Yeah. So you go to a web page on the TV, and then when you go to the web page for your game, there'll be a code, and you'll generate a code, and it'll say type in on the phone app 5827 or something. And then when you do that, it'll synchronize and connect, and then you're registered as a login user.
Yeah, I'm blind. The text is right there in the center too. It says on tablets and Android TV. That makes it pretty obvious. Okay. was like, oh, I was wondering what people were going to plug it into, but no, it's very clear now. That looks cool. I'm gonna have to try that out. Looks like a fun way to make a little game.
It's pretty fun, yeah. 'Cause it's cool having like a bunch of things where you can individually, like on your phone, have secret stuff that interacts with the game that's shared.
Yeah, it could be neat. Not have to deal with the networking part too much, and still build a little networked multiplayer game. Kind of curious how that works.
Reminds
Check it
me
out.
of the Twitch games where you can affect the player through developer commands on the Twitch stream.
Yeah.
I think there was a game called Cluster Truck where this got really funny because the developers would start typing messages over the player's UI and
Yeah,
stopping
flipping the world
time.
upside down, changing stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great.
Yeah, should definitely add that one if you build a game. Add in some features like that. So Andrew found a good question that he wanted the answer to as well, and I want to pop this one up. It said, "What is the point when you look at a piece of code and say, I need or want to implement an interface here?" So when is it that you're looking at something and you're like, this should have an interface? What is it for you guys that kind of pushes you over that point? I kind of know what it is for me, but I'm curious what you guys think. Like, what's the thing that makes you think, "Hey, I need an interface here"?
Do multiple things need to do this? Do I need to make a contract so I can guarantee that they both do it? Interface it. Basically, even if you just want something to cook, if you only have one thing that cooks and it's a chef, you can say chef.cook. But as soon as you want something else to start cooking, say a robot application or the sun, you're saying, well, I still need things to be cooked. Let me just make sure it always works the same way. I don't want to have to write if chef, if sun, if robot. Let me just make thing.cook. And then the interface is, the contract is thing.cook. So you make an interface that facilitates that contract. And then everything that implements I cook, well, they work.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. I think a lot of the time people try to find the interface before they've found the problem, and it's kind of the wrong way to go. That was what I used to do too. It's just kind of like predefined interfaces, guessing what I was going to need. But I think that you find them as you're building things up, but you also have to be willing to refactor and get away from those checking to see if something is something, or if something has an option check. You might start with a Boolean option there and then switch it into, hey, I've got more than two choices. Maybe I can make this another class with an interface that does these implementations different, instead of a switch statement that's checking three things.
You can do that even before you have two things to check. As soon as you need to start adding the second thing, you don't even have to write a lot of code for it. There's literally built into Rider, refactor this, extract interface, and you just checkbox the things that you know that you want to be shared across anything that implements this contract. And Rider does all the code for you. It's zero code involved.
What about you, Jason?
This is a very tough question. So I'm going to end up muddying the waters on this one because my reasoning on this is probably a bit more confusing. For starters, I take it very seriously when I say that interface in 90% of use cases does not mean the interface keyword in C#. That is not what that means. In most cases, you read books and articles and online stuff, and even if the person writing the article doesn't realize it, when they say interface, they mean an interface between two things. They do not mean the word interface as it pertains to C#. And so when I see a question like that, I look at it more as, when do you draw a line between the intent of a thing and the implementation of a thing? And so an example of this is if I wrote if input.get button down fire 1, that already is an implementation. But if I write if should shoot equals input.get button down fire 1, that is technically an interface. It is an abstract. I've moved the question from the implementation. I have established that the thing I want is if should shoot is a different statement than input get button down, which is an implementation of the interface should shoot. And so for that level of interface, I do that almost immediately because it separates my intent from my actions. So I would have code like if should shoot rather than if input get button down raycast blah blah blah. Because even though that's what I'm going for, As I was literally pointing this out to Andrew the last day about intent of the statement. When you read it, you want it to say, you want someone behind you to ask you what you're doing, and you can point to, well, as it says here, if this does this, then this, otherwise do this. The code should read clearly what your intent is, not the magic code that makes it work. So that the answer to that is immediately, but that's not what people usually mean. They mean, when do I make a class with an interface and do all of that stuff? If we're talking about that, that's not a decision that's based on things like names, conventions, or architecture. When I use an interface in classic terms, I use it because of application boundaries and DLLs. So I make that decision based on dynamic linking. To put it another way, whenever you use a using statement, using Newtonsoft.json, you are in, I imagine, like I literally picture a giant chain with a hook being clamped into my code, and it's like you are forever tethered to the concept of Newtonsoft.json. And if you were to take this file and give it to somebody else, you have written a using statement which has bound this code inextricably forever to that other thing. And so the answer, when do I use an interface? It's when I see that happening. I see a chain being attached to my code, and I think, what if they're not using Newtonsoft? What if somebody is using Unity JSON utility or some other, or Beeson or some other serialization? And I stop and I go, what am I really doing? What I'm really doing is saying, take thing, serialize it somehow, give me back a string, and then given a string, serialize it somehow or deserialize it and give me back an object. I will draw that boundary line using a classic interface. And that way I could build two DLLs, one which is things that can be serialized somehow, and one which is implemented via A, B, C, D, E, or F. And that's because literally the way DLLs will work, which anybody who's ever tried to use assembly definitions and don't know what they're doing, you'll get into that weird territory where it can't find your code and you get confused about why it can't see this thing and that doesn't know where that is. That is the magic / mystery of DLLs. And the unfortunate truth is the decision for when I use an interface is when it would cause those kinds of concerns. But that you have to understand interfaces and DLLs to know the answer to those questions. So I can't give a handy guide as to when to do it, because the truth is you just have to know how DLLs work and try to design an architect around those issues. But the first one, the whole when do I interface between two things, that's immediate. Just basically, as soon as you read your code and it reads like code and not like intent, draw a boundary line. And there's a final note on this about why this is important. Imagine something as simple as debug.log. Very simple line. You use it all the time. You'll have written one class and you might write it 100 times. If something, debug log, then this might happen, debug log. Ask yourself a very simple question. What if I wanted to put a checkbox? Only debug log if this checkbox is hit. How many lines of code do you now have to change? The answer could be literally hundreds. If you just did one thing, which said, do a log, string message, and then debug.log message, that one little boundary, that one interface, and everywhere in your code you now use send a message and not debug log. If you do decide to change it, how many changes do you have to make? One, because the boundary line between your implementation and your intent has been put in place. I want to send a message. I happen to be using debug log versus literally use debug log in every case. So,
right. And in that case, I would do it when you actually get to that requirement, right? When you're going to do something like that, because I just find and replace all the debug logs with the new log message, wrap that up in the interface, and then take control over it. I assume you do something somewhat similar.
Well, for logs, obviously, like logs are always going to be interchanged. So I always do. Logging is probably a bad example for that because I will never use debug.log in my code. I will always use a logger, which happens to be debug log, because I will always want to save it possibly to files or filter it or send it to a web service. That's always going to be a thing I want to do depending on the project. But in principle, yes, I won't just start with abstractions all the time. I will start with literally the code I want. And by the time I say, hang on a second, these should save to a different format, I will then put a layer in place and make two format savers.
I do want to cover a small thing that popped up in the comments. Someone mentioned to only have interfaces if you have behaviors and not properties. And they made an example of interactables with player actions. I wanted to bring this up because I literally made an interface today that had 3 properties. And it was, does a pawn motor state provide animation info? And if yes, what the animation state is. For example, is my character motor airborne? What is its velocity.y? Because I want to know if it's falling or rising up. And these are not methods, these are properties, which internally they're methods, but they're not behavior, they just report things back to you.
I do that all the time in interfaces as well. I have read-only, especially get-only properties where I want to be able to view the state of something, whether it's ready, whether some condition is met or something else.
I mean, a
And
classic
there's
one's a predicate, right? Like a classic condition where
Yeah.
it's just a thing that says is valid or is good to go or is ready. You want to have something that I've done this with like tasks. You run a task and say is complete. You don't want to do something until the complete's done. You don't want to have to define what complete is for a million different things. You just want to say do some stuff. When you're done, I can move on to the next one. So sometimes I will just have a check.
There's also one more thing I wanted to bring up with properties. You can also use them for setting things, because Jason Story once showed me an example where he made a shop, and the shop had a display, and it wanted to say fill the shop. What's the shop? It wanted to display a message, and it just wanted to set it. It didn't need to know to get something and then work with that. It just said set to this value. And it didn't care what it does, because the interface said, you can only set this. You can't get it. Just set it.
Oh, good point. I forgot about those, the set-only ones.
I still think I'm one of the few people who actually use those. I think that's a missed art. I think people need to really. I think there's a good design philosophy there about why something should, in wherever possible, you only need to provide value. You don't need to get them, or vice versa. Sometimes you only need to read them and not get them. And I think people need to really think about that more. I think a lot of interfaces arbitrarily just have get and set, and they don't realize that from a interface segregation concept, you're actually doing two things there. You're saying this thing can simultaneously provide values and have values set, and that might not be the intent you want. For a kind of a whole tangent on this, if you're actually using the repository pattern properly, you should not, I repeat, you should not have a save function. That may sound counterintuitive because people look at repositories and think they're savable, but no, implementations may be savable. But the point of a repository pattern is to disguise data so it looks like an in-memory collection. And if you're disguising data to look like an in-memory collection, you shouldn't have to save it. So that's where you get into the unit of work pattern and how you save things using a different route. But the point is, your interfaces should say what they need. And so an iRepository is not the same as something that is savable. A persistent store is not the same as a repository.
Yeah, there's also the nice classic English where you say provider if it's just providing things.
Cool. So what question do you guys want to take next? There are a couple in here, and I'm not sure which one seems the most.
Well, not going to lie, I'm going to take a bathroom break first, so you guys can run without me for a minute.
All right. You guys have any preferences? Something you want to dive into?
Yeah, just let me find it in my small document. So there was a question by Zoe Samus. I added a camera to a level in my game, and now platforms move up and down when my player jumps, while my floor and any objects on the platform stay still. How do I stop them from moving? Also, I was wondering if there is a way to a camera option that will start at the end of my level to show where you are trying to get to, and then move back to my player. Thanks, Zoe. So this question has two things in it, and I wanted to address them separately. The first one just sounds like a bug. Maybe you have two cameras in your scene, and one of them only renders the platforms and moves with the player. So when the player moves, you see the platforms moving, but everything else does not. So that would be it for the first one. The second one, about how to make the camera show the end of the level and then move back to the player. There are multiple ways you can address this, but the simplest one would likely be if you're using Cinemachine, you can set a camera at the end of the level. Then a timeline can just say, after a bit of time, switch this camera off with a smooth transition back to the player camera. If you don't use Cinemachine, it's just a case of making a script say, hey, look at this transform, and then over time transition back to my transform. You can use any smooth animation that you want for that. Even the Unity Animator system can just make an animation that has which camera is the most important float and turn it from one side to the other if you don't want to deal with code. Otherwise, you can just make a script that lerps or use DoTween or anything else.
Have you used the blend list camera from Cinemachine?
Yes, I have, although my memory of it isn't that great.
No, but it'll
you-
do some of that transitioning. It'll go like from one camera to another, and I think I've used it going across screen, like from an end to a beginning, because you can just put in a delay and a transition time and give it the two cameras, and it would go straight across too. If you don't want to write the code yourself, I guess. But I think a timeline probably gives you a lot more control over when and how that happens.
So there was that. One other question was George Kletsas asked Jason and Jason. I guess we should. Oh, yeah, there you go. The other
There is
Jason.
that.
You rang?
So George Kletsas asked, Jason and Jason, can you name some resources to learn about Unity code architecture and C#/Unity tricks, except for yours and, of course, Infallible Code? So,
Whew. I'll let you go first, Jason.
Okay.
I would recommend
said-
Jason Story's YouTube channel.
Kind of feels like cheating, but okay. I've said this before. If you're trying to learn C#, just get better at the language. There is no better resource on the internet than Pluralsight. It's dated at this stage in some of the videos or whatever, but it is Microsoft certified professionals who have training in presentation, who go through everything. So there's topics I've touched on here that I haven't really gone into, like date time in C#. Like a lot of people don't realize that that's there, and there's a whole lot of other stuff like how do you make sure dates are accurate? How do you support different time zones and localization? There is literally like 5 hours of content on Pluralsight that just talks about the concept of what a date is as it pertains to C#. There is infinite amounts of detail. There's literally a section called tips and traps, and there's like 3 series of that, which is like 10 hours of I bet you didn't know this about C#. That tends to be where I got a lot of the really arcane and obtuse things. There's a load of great tutors on there, and they cover really complicated down to the simple topics. So if it's just C# as a general principle, you can't get better than Pluralsight. As for more specific stuff, there's different recommendations I would give. Like if you're looking for C# architecture, there's certain tutors on Pluralsight I recommend. Deborah Karat is great for beginner stuff. Then Elton Stoneman's great for enterprise stuff. And then you've got Zoran Harvard, who's great for defensive programming stuff. But then you can go into much bigger, various different concepts. There's a lot of resources out there. And honestly, a lot of the Microsoft certified people tend to know what they're talking about. But if you're new to like advanced C#, just get a Pluralsight account. I can honestly say, just like you get a week free. Just go through there. They have what's called learning paths. So you start at C# fundamentals and work your way down through. There is literally hundreds of hours of stuff, and even if you think you know the answers, there's probably at least 20% of the content will be new to you. So, like, there are other resources. I could give you a long list, but honestly, if you haven't exhausted Pluralsight, I literally have watched hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of Pluralsight content. If you haven't gone through all of that, the other stuff isn't really necessary. So come back to me after you've spent about 4 years consuming all of Pluralsight, and then I'll give you some more resources.
Nice. So I've got a couple others. Pluralsight is probably my number one too. It's the one out of all the things that I've used for the longest time. It's the one. It's PLUAR plural. I can't spell Pluralsight. SIGHT. You'll find it. It's cool. That's like 20 or 30 bucks a month. I forget, but it's definitely worth it. Especially as you're going through those things. Go through the C# stuff, and the design patterns library was probably one of my favorites. There was one or a couple other things I would want to recommend. I know that Jason talks about Uncle Bob stuff all the time, but in general, his videos are I'd say really good about just the higher level architecture and how to think about code architecture and code design. If you just watch it, it's kind of like a mix between learning and entertainment at the same time. You'll get some random old stories and lots of cool real world stories about stuff that's happened and problems and why they went with certain solutions and why those solutions exist. I really like those. Also, I've lately been watching a bit more of Llewellyn Falco and Woody Zool on YouTube and Pluralsight too. They're both just really good at explaining and teaching things. So they talk a lot about architecture and refactoring and stuff. So I'd look at them as well. Outside of that, I'm not sure. There are a lot of sources out there, but one of the whole reasons I started a YouTube channel and a blog and stuff was because when I started with Unity, there wasn't really much out there at all. There was one, I think there were 2 books available, and I bought them both, and they both kinda, like, covered the very basics, like, I could play a sound and move an object, but there wasn't anything really complicated, so I started making a bunch of stuff, and in that process, I probably lost track of some of the stuff. Oh, one other thing, GDC talks. Not all of them, but some of the GDC talks are really good on architectural and just more advanced code topics, so something I'd recommend. What about, Yorai or Andrew? What do you guys got?
Well, I was going to bring up the GDC Vault, just like you
Sorry.
did, because I've been consuming it nonstop for the past 2 months or so. I actually got the subscription to the whole Vault, so I've been watching a lot of it. The GDC talks are more generalized about game development in general, as the name suggests, the Game Developer Convention. But you will find a lot of optimization tricks from the trenches of games that had to ship with like very minimalistic specs for amazing features like entire swaying nature and a bazillion NPCs in one screen. There was this specific one about Assassin's Creed and how they turn down the settings on anything you can't see, and as things get close, they actually stop being real things and they just look like it, and it's amazing. Beyond that, there's of course the YouTube channels for people like Code Monkey and Turbo Makes Games if you want the more advanced stuff regarding performance. There's also Dapper Dano and
GameDev Guide.
Yeah, and you can even go for Mix and Jam because games, after all. Yeah.
Lots of YouTubers out there.
Yeah, I was gonna say YouTube as well. I think it can be a very entertaining resource. It's free, and I would definitely avoid though books now. But my first experience was also with a book I got from, actually 2 books I got from Barnes & Noble, and the first one had bugs in it. So I got stuck after like chapter 5 or something, and I had no idea how to fix it. But then the other thing is, while the things like the forums or other online resources like that are oftentimes great resources, they can also lead you astray. So I would often try to avoid taking anything from that type of resource as a scripture, really.
Just gonna double check it against some other content or other sources.
Yeah, especially if it's old, 8 years old. Sometimes it's accurate, but then oftentimes things have changed in that period.
There's a way better way, yeah. And on that point of books, like I think that when it comes to those more instructional beginner books, they do tend to get outdated really fast, right? Like this, because the life cycle on getting a book out there, published, released, printed, and all that, like by the time it gets into your hands, it's years old. It's like watching a 5-year-old YouTube video sometimes, because it had to be planned out a year before it got written, and then they go through long processes on this. So one of the reasons I like the more high level architectural books and concept books or design books instead of as a beginner source. So I think that's good advice. But they are handy to have. Like I still bought them anyway, just to have there.
There's also one more thing that I want to bring up as sort of a devil's advocate, but the Microsoft MSDN is actually fantastic for getting information about how a class works, because they usually come with examples, and the examples might have things you never even thought of, and they directly link to everything relevant because it's Microsoft. One other resource that's probably worth bringing up is the Refactoring Guru site, which has explanations for a lot of things you might have interest in as you get into middle level programming.
Refactoring Gurus?
Refactoring Guru. It's I linked it just now.
Refactoring.
Yeah,
Guru.
I bought their course to give it a try. It's fine. I don't want to get into a big rant about my personal opinions on some of the decisions, but it's probably a pretty good beginner resource.
If anything, it at least covers the big concepts under the refactoring tab and what is refactoring on the left.
Oh, okay. I haven't
so
seen this. I'm going to have to check this out.
Just click refactoring on the left here and then go to what is refactoring. And then on the left again, just below it.
Oh, right here. Fine.
Yeah. And there you go. You have clean explanation for causes of technical debt and et cetera, et cetera. It's more high level things to think about. But it is something that you can keep in mind as you try to get more serious about maintaining things healthy for a long time.
Nice. Yeah, I'm gonna have to dig through this technical debt. That's what's on. That's behind the little skeleton head. There is my technical debt cost chart that I printed from talking to Chris, talking about the costs and the pains of technical debt. It's a bad thing, but it's
actually been my one-stop shop for people who have problems and they don't know how to solve and they don't have a lot of time. I'm like, well, your problem is actually described like this. Here's a page describing the exact problem you're having. Also, here are some common solutions to it. By the way, their names are after you finished reading them.
Nice. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, I'm going to have to dig through that because it seems like it's got a lot of good info there. Sorry, I'm like looking at a web page nobody else can see. Speaking of things people can't see, I wanted to share the stream for the one that I'm going to kick off tomorrow. It's already scheduled out, 10 o'clock tomorrow. So whatever, in about 22 and a half hours, we'll be kicking off. So make sure that if you're watching now or later, just go click on that and watch it and stream and join us and hit thumbs up and all that stuff. Make sure that I share that before I forget. I meant to share it like an hour ago, but I totally forgot about it. All right. What other questions you guys want to hit? I know. Actually, I want to stop. I want to jump in with one because there was one that I had highlighted that I keep forgetting to ask too, and this was from Arcane Sin again about could you guys take a poll among your audiences to see how interested they are in having some sort of way to get connected with your colleagues through some sort of referral platform / program. And I wanted to answer this because I've had multiple people ask me this question in like the last month or so, mostly privately, not on here. And they're generally just people who are developers who are looking to get into the industry and looking for some connections, either looking for open opportunities, open contracts, and other things. And in general, I just do this. Like, I don't have any specific program or setup for it. I just, as soon as I hear about jobs and I hear about people that are looking for things, I tend to share them with each other or introduce them to each other. A lot of the times I'll have people who reach out to me relatively regularly that are looking for positions or looking for contracts, and I'll share them. I've just, I think, recently shared out a couple contracts with people. So I don't know. I was kind of curious. Is this something that a lot of people in chat are interested in, like finding opportunities or getting connections? Because I mean, it's not something that I have a lot of time for, but there are people out there who've asked and offered to do this kind of thing and make these connections before. So is this something that people are very interested in? If so, I guess just let me know in the chat. Just drop it in there and maybe leave a comment if you're watching later. Then if there are a lot of people who are interested in this, we can figure something out. But what about you guys? You guys have any thoughts on this? Just on referring people for jobs, or do you have any suggestions for people that are looking for this kind of opportunity?
Well, if we're talking suggestions, there's plenty. If we're talking about personal experiences, I did see in the Infallible Code, there's a job posting channel in the Discord. So you could probably try and use that. The problem is you're only handling a small community when you're doing this. So it's a connection. People who follow Infallible Code all go there. They can all see it. But it's not going to be direct. if you are trying to find more people to get interested in you, you need to show your face, and that means your name needs to show up with things that get them interested. Usually that would be by the form of answering other people in communities that make you interested. Other than that, there's getting your name out there with the cool things you did on, say, social media, Twitter, LinkedIn even, etc. Because if your name is not there, people don't know who you are, they can't even come and ask you. If they ever once saw you in, say, a server they like, they might remember you exist. If you solved problems that they know they're having, they might think to ask you. And then if they have a serious problem that they need you on board because they know you can do it, they might give you the job. So get your name out there.
Yeah, and I will say you touched on exactly why my Discord doesn't have a job posting section, because from personally, I find like there is showcases. You can go to any of the Discords and like show off stuff you're doing, and I find job posting tends to be a little bit of a pyramid scheme where there's just people who want job spamming with no indication or proof of either ability or desire to work, and oftentimes if you foster that kind of community, you're promoting people to engage without engaging, or to spam, or to whatever. And so I find the truth is, if somebody wants work done, they'll probably take a look at showcase sections and find good stuff. Likewise, if you're in a community like mine or Infallible Codes, and I see that you've done cool examples of animations or character controllers or particle systems, and I see somebody say, do you know anybody who's good at X, Y, or Z? I won't point them at a random job posting site. I will try to connect the two people, because I will keep an eye out for people who have shown skill or ability in one area. So my unfortunate answer is, I don't personally like promoting a vague sort of connection of people that I don't have any understanding of their ability or skills. I just don't think that's a healthy environment. I think you're better off promoting, putting yourself out there, engaging with communities, and then be noticeable. And if you're noticeable, people will take notice. And if I ever see somebody needs something done, I will go through my communities and DM people and say, hey, I know a person looking for something. I've seen you do this stuff before. Are you interested? And I find that's how a lot of, because at the end of the day, part of this is me putting my name as somebody, I recommend this person. And if I don't know you, I can't do that, right? It's unfair of me to assume that you can do something that you can't, or I can't, or whatever. So it needs to have some visual indication of ability, and there's no better way to do that than actually engaging in communities and helping out doing it. So you won't see that coming from me anytime soon, I'll put it that way.
And that's usually been, I'd say actually that's always been the case for me. Everybody that I've recommended, I've seen them write some code, I've seen some of the stuff that they've done, and then sent them over to the other person to let them evaluate as well. And a lot of time it ends up just being students who've worked on stuff, and I've seen their code in their projects they've submitted and stuff, or people who are working on their own games and their own projects, and I've seen the stuff that they've built and have a good idea of their capabilities. And I think that's an important thing. You have to be able to show what you can do at the level that you're trying to get hired at, I guess. It's an important thing to do. But I think it's something to look into a little bit more. It's something I'm going to consider more and see if there's something I can do to make it maybe a little bit easier for people, that isn't like a full-time thing. I definitely don't want to get into the business of referring jobs or anything like full-time, or having like
But that
a
being
job
said,
site.
I would say, just as a kind of one note on that, is that may sound very defeatist or sort of down on the idea, but I want to make it clear, I am super promoting use the showcase channels. Like, I'm talking, if you did anything fun, if you did, like, sometimes I'll just put something up there and say, like, for example, there's something on my Discord from today where it's like, been playing with the new volumetric lighting in 2022. It's cool. And I just post a little image or a little GIF or something. It doesn't have to be full projects. You're not showing off your game or trying to sell it. Just if you did something cool, post it in one of the showcase channels. And that way people will just see it, remember it, and they'll associate it. So I think you should be very active in those communities and just show progress on things you're doing. And I think that's the way this works, right? You start to, like, how many people have been following a game without realizing it on the /r Unity 3D? Like, you've been watching a game develop over months, and then the minute it comes out for sale, you feel this almost like need to buy it because you feel like you've been on a journey with them and you want to take part in like the crescendo of buying it. And that's like part of the viral marketing portion. In the same way, if you're watching someone develop things and get better at building models or designing stuff, if you want to hire someone, you've got proof that they both know how to do it and they furthered their journey and are a self-learner. Like, there's no better person to hire than the person you've been watching get better each week as they post cool stuff. Like, that's the best like resume you could give me. A sign that you're actively working on stuff and getting better at it, and I can see it happen, you know?
The good intent and self-sufficiency is also nice. One thing that you did touch on is that as you are showcasing things, even if they're not the greatest, you still put a sign up that, hey, I'm actively working. And Jason just now posted an email in the chat, which prompted me to bring up, you need to make yourself easy to contact, because that's one thing I see a lot of people fall on. They might make the best thing ever, but if you have no way to say, hey, message this person, I want to ask them if they can work for me, if they don't have this button, you'll never hear back from them. And I'll fall down on that because they just don't put their email up anywhere. People will need to make accounts on random sites just to try and contact them. The sites might not be the easiest to traverse or are not specialized just to find jobs. So make yourself easy to contact, make a specialized email, put it wherever you can if you're trying to get a job. Put your best stuff right beside it, because that's what's going to get people to click. So there's a question up.
Yeah, for production, what version of Unity currently recommend? I think that for me, LTS, any LTS version, but not the newest ones, unless there's something that you absolutely need. But if you're getting close to production, I wouldn't want to change anything at all, right?
I guess
I would say with that, they are getting slightly better. Like I'll give credit to Unity. It's becoming less and less of a pain with each subsequent version. Like migrating from 2015 to like anything higher is a nightmare. But going from 2020 to 2022, there'll be a few texture issues and stuff, but you won't lose your project like you used to in older days. I wouldn't worry as much about it anymore, but I would say that sometimes random stuff will break. I cannot stress this enough. I've migrated from versions of Unity, and literally in one of the versions on Android, resources.load didn't work correctly on Android. And as a result, it killed like 2 weeks of project development because this is weird bug introduced that was like on a platform where some of the code was in a DLL, whole big nightmare. In short, don't do it arbitrarily. But I would say try to keep relatively up to date with LTS versions so that when the time comes to migrate, you're doing it in small incremental steps rather than having to jump 5 versions where stuff will cause big breaks. So yeah, stick with LTSs, but try to keep less than one LTS behind and try to keep it going as things move on.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up that you should probably try and update your project once in a while. Don't stay too behind, because then if they stop, even the long-term support versions, the LTS, have a lifespan that is going to run out. So you do want to upgrade once in a while, just to make sure that you're on the whatever LTS that feels safe for you. It's a small cost, but you're going to need it if new things pop up. If a new platform releases and you want to go on that, if your game needs whatever new features, then you don't have access unless you upgrade Unity. I generally would stick to the latest LTS personally, just because I don't want to deal with bugs that got solved 1 year later and find out in retrospect. Of course, new bugs can get introduced because it's Unity, but...
Speaking of those random bugs, Jason, you'd mentioned like weird things happening. That's the biggest one that I had. Is the biggest weird Unity story was when I upgraded from Unity 5.5 to 5.6. We had this game. It was this Blade Shield game. It's literally a lightsaber game with a shield in VR. You're getting shot at by robots, reflecting things, slicing them, and all that crap, right? Everything worked fine. We're just about to release it. It's built in Unity 5.5. The game is ready to go. It's on Steam, and we're like almost ready to flip the switch, right? The next week. But then they released the 5.6. There was an update in there that made it so that VR performance was increased by like 30%. It was just a Steam VR across the board increase. They're like, all right, fine, we'll just do the upgrade. We'll get that increase, no code change, everything's fine. Do the upgrade, release the update, and all of a sudden, like, people are just randomly dying. Shots are no longer colliding. The collisions with the shields are failing. They're just going right through. Collisions with the swords, not all the time, just somewhat randomly would fail. And it all I don't we never found out the exact cause of the bug, but there's something in that version of Unity. It went away in a later 5.6 update where something was just fucked up with the collisions there, and it was causing them to just come through. It was a really weird scenario, and something I never would have expected. And I was positive it wasn't from upgrading Unity. I was positive something else must have gone wrong. You realize after a good amount of testing and a lot of frustration, like, no, it's just that something happened in this Unity update that broke everything, and we don't have the time to go in and magically fix it, and already released a busted update. So gotta watch out for that. All
Yeah,
right.
that happened.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that happened years ago when Substance was still supported natively in Unity. I think it was 5.4 had an issue where you couldn't export textures in the same way that you could otherwise. So, you know, all of my assets at that time were all about customizing in the editor and then export the final for your game. And 5.4, you couldn't do that. A lot of people liked 5.4 for a variety of other reasons. Suddenly I was getting all these bad reviews because it wouldn't work. And I'm like, it's never going to work in 5.4. So if you want this feature, everything else works. But that one feature doesn't work in 5.4. So you can't use 5.4. It was a big problem for about a year and a half or 2 years until people finally moved on and just slowly migrated away from 5.4.
Wow. Yeah, it was a rough time back then. So, we're actually kind of getting short on time. I wanted to jump onto. I know I wanted to do the code review, but I don't think we have enough time to give enough detailed review of it. So I wanted to just instead see if I could get people to load me up with ideas for this game jam instead. Get some fun, interesting game jam ideas for the Lego Ninjago jam. And as everybody, if you haven't seen the Lego jam, you should probably just go do a quick Google search. It looks pretty interesting. They're just doing a game jam based off of Ninjago assets, which are just the Lego ninjas. Andrew, I assume you know a little bit about that. Have you seen the Lego Ninjago game jam that's going on? I just saw the video came out a couple days ago.
I heard wind of it. I haven't seen the video myself. I do think it's neat. I saw the other day there Unreal was doing a live stream and Unity was doing a live stream at the same time. Unreal's was all about scripting and rigging some character. It was all high fidelity, and Unity's was with the Lego folks doing a Lego game and just showing how you could do a Lego game. And I just thought that was just an interesting difference between the two companies and their streams. And I appreciate how Lego is just fun in general, and everyone seems to love Lego. And that's it. That's my story.
Nice. Well, yeah, they're doing that jam, and it's like a one button game you got to build with the Lego assets. And I've been trying to come up with ideas. I've got a couple of them that I got from students in the architecture course, and I want to hear what you guys have to say. What do you got, Yorai?
Bullet trees. Sorry, it's harkening back to a video that I really liked from you two. So when a game has one button, you don't really have a lot of ability to interact with it in different ways. It's a commodity of what you can do with this one click. So usually there are time windows where clicking would be good for you. You can use durations of the time you hold, and you can use the spaces between when you hold, regardless of the time window. So these are all elements you can use to complexify how one button works. That's basically one thing that I would point out first, because gameplay is always king for me. And I try to make sure the gameplay is interesting before I even think about how things look. What can I do with the constraints I have? So
No, that makes sense. And just to clarify for everybody watching too, the gameplay for this is probably going to be pretty damn simple. I'm imagining, so there on the page it says that the winning ones are going to be put into some like installation in the Lego stores. So there's going to be little kids coming up and playing and interacting with it. for maybe 30 seconds to a minute or so. So it's going to have to be something that's probably relatively easy to learn, where you can get the grasp of it in maybe 15 seconds or less, and not too complicated. Because I've got a lot of ideas that I wanted to do, and then I realized they were all way outside of the scope. I mean, I think I had mentioned earlier in the call that what my first idea was to build like a Team Fortress Tactics with Legos, right? Like Lego dudes battling some sort of an auto battler type game going on, just because I wanted to do something with Mirror as well. But then I realized, oh yeah, this is for kids. This is for little tiny toddlers who are gonna walk up and like tap the screen, and they need to be able to win even though they don't know what the hell they're doing. So I'm gonna try to come up with something that fits, I guess, into that theme, but is still not terribly boring and looks pretty cool and somewhat interesting to code. Kind of the
You know what,
goal.
one thing
So
you could do, which would be fun and really fits the Lego theme, you could basically just make Katamari Damacy, right? Like it's Legos attaching stuff. You can just have a ball that rolls through a scene and collects Lego blocks and clicks onto it and builds a bigger Lego thing as you eat the terrain around you.
what do you do with the button? What's the button play?
Button can be jump. So if you jump, you slam on things and it like eats more of the surrounding area. So it becomes more of a gameplay thing than a specific target. And the goal is just to eat as much stuff before a time limit, so you get a bigger score if you consumed more of the terrain.
Yeah,
And
you can
if
also
people
do.
have ideas in chat, please start spamming them in. I want to get some ideas while we talk about these. Go ahead.
You can also do something as simple as an auto-running Mario where you jump just to get over obstacles, and it's like no game over or anything. The character just stops, so you have to keep jumping, and you can make the jumps a bit interesting with the times when you jump. But if it's for kids, really just don't have a loose condition. Just try to make it as fun as possible within the time.
Yeah, that could be a fun one. Or a race could be interesting too. Some sort of racing game. I have no
It's like
idea
as
what
fast
that
as
would
you
look
can.
like. Where they're running or flying or something, ninjaing as fast as they can. I like the running idea. That was one of the things I was considering, is like ninjas running across the rooftops and like jumping across and double jumping. But you do have that condition of like you could lose and fail, which probably doesn't work great for toddlers.
Actually, you can do something very simple and very nice. You can use timeline to make the ninja running across rooftops. And if you don't press jump, the ninja just stands there and wait. You have to press jump in order to make the jump skip happening. And that's just something cute and easy that kids can do.
And then you can even use Cinemachine and Dolly Tracks to make sure that it has a nice wavy path that never actually leaves anything, and you just move back and forth along a safe path.
Yeah.
Not a bad idea. Yeah, just stop there and wait and just time how long it takes them to get to the end of the buildings. It's like a little timed thing. Make sure they hit the button in time.
Yeah, you don't
somebody
even
asked
have to
when
make sure they
jamming-
hit the. You don't even have to make sure they hit the button in time. You can just make a sequence end when the ninja reaches the end of, say, a roof, and then the click will make it jump to the next one. And if they do it right, there's just going to be a smooth transition. And the lowest amount of time it takes them is a score if you need it.
That's good. Yeah, that could definitely work. All right.
I would say if it was me, I'd be looking at if you've only got one button, there's not much, as we said, there's not a lot you can do in terms of different complex gameplay mechanics. But what you could do is, I think one of the most overlooked mechanics or sort of most valued for low effort is the idea of something customizing. Like, how many times have we all spent 2 hours sitting there playing with the character creator for a game that you never see outside of first person? So when it comes to Lego, it's about building. And if it was me, what I would probably end up making is I would have a car or some vehicle that's like got 6 steps of building. First the wheels, then the body, then the spoiler/boosters, then the front or whatever. And what it does is it just spins randomly between a bunch of procedural different sets of things. And you tap the button like you're hitting a some slot machine, and every time you do it, you're building a piece of your car, and then when your car is done, it builds the car and it just starts an autorunner, and your car will have stats relative to whether it's heavy or slow or whatever, and then you just press space to press the button to jump now. So it's like a quick mini game where 1 builds a car real quickly, 2 races around and jumps over stuff, and then you get to the end and you get a score. So it's pretty quick, infinitely replayable, customized to each person. Can't go wrong.
I'm thinking like a Tetris Dr. Mario thing with Lego bits falling down, and you have to create characters and other things to do whatever, and then just one button, tap it to move to the right, and then hold to make it go down.
There's definitely the magic of having a Tetris block fall just right, and if you click the down button, it falls instantly and makes this nice trail and pop effect.
And maybe if you like complete a character, it does a special attack that destroys other blocks around it or something.
I don't think that'll let me use the Lego Ninjago dudes though.
Oh, they don't let you do that?
Well, I mean, they're minifigures, right? So you can't really build them in pieces.
Oh, that's too bad.
Right.
Aren't the Lego
you
humanoids?
Probably could if you were artistic, but I'm not. Go ahead.
No, I'm pretty sure Lego characters are made from a bottom piece, a top piece, and a head, and then a head accessory like hair or something. So you could at least customize those 4 parts.
Yeah, you just couldn't do the whole Tetris-y setup. In fact, I've got they're over there now. My Lego dudes have moved. They were
but you don't have to go like exact Tetris. You can make like the center has nothing, and then you show like shadows and legs, and it cycles between 4 of them. You click, and then the legs like go straight to the center. There's a pop flash. Then you pick the top body the same way, the character's head, and then their hair/mask, and then finally weapons. And now they're ready to go. Play a little animation like, yay, it's ready. And then
important rule: no weapons.
On
the rules, you can't have any weapons.
Okay.
You can't have any violence. You can't have any military vehicles. Jason had recommended tanks.
One other option would be you could go Super Mario 3 and do the where it's got the 3 different parts. So again, we talked about hair, head, and like torso, and you could have it like pick one, and you have to try to match it. So as they go through, you have to hit the button to like line it up and match the character, kind of like a snap game.
Yeah, that seems too hard for a 4-year-old. Being able to time things like that and match stuff. I'm really trying to think of targeting it down to like who's that. If on the random, it's definitely not going to happen. Off chance that it was put into a Lego installation, I want it to at least be fun for a little kid that's playing it. Which makes it not very fun for me to play. But then again, I figure that no matter what Lego Ninjago game I make, it's probably not going to be that much fun for me to play. So
in that case, just have a button that loads up a web browser and starts a random PewDiePie video. Done. Problem solved.
It is PewDiePie.
One thing I do want to mention is that kids probably don't enjoy waiting as much. There is no immediate satisfaction in waiting. So if you do want to make something that makes a kid excited and hyped up and just clicking, let them smash the button as fast as possible. Just say, click the button as much as you can. The ninja will run faster and be happier, and there's particles and stuff. Done.
That could work too. Just having the ninja run faster every time you click just adds some speed, and then it slows back down as they stop clicking. Just kind of click to run, and then you click and you get to the right point, and you'll jump automatically.
Just remember, nobody cares about the game mechanics as much as they care about the juice and the reward from the clicks.
Yeah, pretty much. Gotta look pretty.
Yeah.
Cool. And let's see. Were there any other cool ideas in chat? A sword that can cut fruit would be cool if we could have swords. Oh, one jump horse race things where you just, like essentially timing the jumps. I think we kind of talked about that. Rhythm games like DDR. That was kind of that one finger death punch you mentioned, right? It was kind of like a rhythm game essentially. And we looked through that earlier, Jason.
I was addicted to that game for a long time. I completed the first. I spent probably about 50 hours between it and the sequel. There's just something endlessly satisfying about putting on some cool music and just. It probably also goes back to the time, right? Because when I was younger, it was all about those animated stick figure fight sequences. There was a whole lot of those on Newgrounds, and so getting to actually play that yourself for the first time was really cool.
I need to play that one. In fact, I might play that a little bit tonight just to get a little bit more inspiration for tomorrow because it looked really interesting and pretty cool and relatively simple. And I like the idea. It might be like a fun one to actually build, although it's probably a little bit too hard for a 4-year-old. More to think about it, but I don't know. I'll figure it out. Let's see. Let's get this popped up in here. So I think I will stop monopolizing everybody's time with my questions for suggestions and just tell everybody to go make sure that if you haven't already joined over on that stream, go click on it and hit the like button so you'll be there tomorrow. And then click on Andrew's stream and set a reminder like I'm doing right now because he's about to go live building a saving and loading setup for loot. What is this, Andrew? What is it that you're going to be doing? I'm going to go hit like. Look at that.
Yeah, the screenshot's a little misleading. I'm redoing the game modules right now, working on items and whatnot. So I think today we're going to move on towards the stats and skills and redoing that to some degree and linking them all together in beautiful, easy button clicking data organizational goodness.
Nice. That'd be interesting. I'll check it out. And you're starting in 20 minutes?
About 20 minutes. Just have to eat some food in the middle. That's important.
Oh, I'll be watching. I already hit the like button. I'm waiting for everybody else to hit thumbs up on that one.
Hit the like button and stay hydrated.
Yes. Good reminder.
And I'll drop the link for that in chat, and we'll put it on to the description as well, so everybody can just kind of click through to it. Is there anything else you guys wanted to talk about before we wrap things up for the week?
There was one topic I wanted to bring up that made me think about something we talked previously, which is I've been so I don't know how it goes for everyone else, but I recycle a lot of the things I consume at house. And something came up to mind where recycling game resources is actually a topic that's not talked about enough. People talk about pooling, but there's also other forms by which you can recycle elements even within the game, just game design-wise, purposefully, and the code revolving around it. So, for example, recycling systems that you write for saying, hey, something ended, call an event, that can be used for a game mode ending its time, or a projectile running out of time so destroy itself, or other things. And I wanted to know your thoughts if you have anything that you use recycling for that you think is under talked about.
But it works for assets too, right? Like I learned a very valuable lesson from a friend of mine who made a game, and he's literally done talks on the concept of kit bashing. And I have no artistic talent, and not even in terms of scene composition. And so watching him take an asset pack, which looks like a crappy random asset pack, and he like weaves it so it looks consistent and the lighting matches and all the stuff is there, and he builds a scene out of it. And then you look at stuff and he's like, that's an upside down plane. That's like a toaster on its side. And it's like, how does it look like a sci-fi city? I don't understand. And so people who are good at this are really good at seeing how you can reuse environmental elements, so you can keep your textures low and your various different assets low by just literally scaling and reusing things. And one of the most classic examples ever is still Mario, is the fact that the clouds are the exact same as the bushes. They're not like the bushes, they are the same thing. They're just painted a different color. And so it's kind of interesting when you realize how many games the stuff in the distance might just be a bigger version of a small thing somewhere else. Or in the case of Zelda Ocarina of Time, the textures for characters' knees is the same texture that's used on the side of certain buildings, but you'd never know this unless you're actually paying attention.
Yeah, I'm terrible at that stuff when it comes to art specifically, but for code, I like to make everything as recyclable and reusable as possible, at least inside of a project. And I don't reuse things across projects often, but a lot of the time with systems in general, I try to see if there's a way to extend out one system to support whatever it is I need for the other one instead of building out entire new systems. But when it comes to the art stuff, I've seen exactly what Jason's seen, and I'm always blown away by it, but I can't fucking do it. Like, I make everything look even worse when I try to mix and match stuff. What other scenarios are you thinking of there, though, Yora? I assume you got some other ideas in mind.
Well, I've been mostly trying to talk about it from a code perspective and the nature of the channel, but when you work in a game, there's the game design of you don't need 50 mechanics. You can make one mechanic have a lot of implementation implementations and purposes, and I'm trying to think of like the small things of in Mario you jump to get over obstacles, but then you also jump to smash into blocks, and that gives you the rewards from the block's contents. Then there's the jumping over enemies in order to eliminate them. You can argue they're obstacles, but the implementation gives you a very different gameplay feel. And I just want to highlight there's a lot that you can gain just from very simple mix and just making sure the code is easy enough to work with, and then using it for a million different purposes. Don't get too hung up if you're just using code classes, because making a destroyer class and then you're putting in 500 different places and you need to make one change to the destroyer class, you're not going to have a great time. But other than that,
I think a good example of what you're talking about is I noticed in Thomas Brush's games, he's got this thing called a destructible. And a destructible is just a thing that the player can hit, which explodes, which may or may not show particles, which may or may drop something from some collection of things. And you might think, okay, fine, but like that actually accounts for a lot of stuff. That can be used for destroying doors that you have to hit a number of times to break. It can be pots that don't do anything but are terrain. It can be plants that like wave when you hit them. It can be, you know, literally anything in the environment. And so that's a single piece of code with a number of checkboxes and settings that can be used in so many permutations that it covers a lot of cases. So yeah, there's a lot of benefit to having systems that are modular enough but sensible in terms of not being too complicated.
And the best code is the code that you don't need to write. So the smallest amount of code you have, the easier it is to know what's going on, and the easier it is to just get working. So try to think if
for example,
you're using your code
project,
in multiple places. If you do, don't repeat.
Yeah,
go ahead.
In a current project I'm on, I needed a trigger box. It's just literally the standard trigger box that you enter and it does a thing. And I wanted to use it for a light switch. I wanted to use it for a door. I wanted to use it for when a certain AI bot hits a trigger point that causes some sensor to go off. It's just a trigger box. And rather than code it into various things, I just made a thing with a gizmo in the scene with a little option for what the filter is and what can be seen. And that one piece of code is reused. It's also the same thing used for death zones, right? You put it outside of zones, drag a big box. When you hit it, you die. And so the concept of there is a thing that can be entered by a thing which causes something to happen is a very standard and reusable chunk of code. And all of the shininess around gizmos and shapes and where it's drawn in the scene and stuff can all be just written once and reused indefinitely.
Yeah, and Nate mentions in the chat that you can use Unity events that are really generic to make a lot of that easy to hook up. So you can just make a single script like that and then make it do some other customizable stuff beyond that, just with a simple Unity event in there. Oh.
Robert asked about do I have to put if statements in for that box? No, the way I do it personally is I have a box which has a get component call to an interface type of handler, and it has two methods that are called on entered, on exited, and so the filtering is handled by the box. And then when you connect it to it, whatever script is connected to it receives events of what comes in and out. And so you can connect literally a kill thing that arrived, or reward thing that arrived, or add to things inventory. And so I don't have to change the code. The stacked behaviors on the object represent whatever it does.
All right, guys. Well, I think we're just about out of time and answered a ton of questions. So next week, we're going to be back with a slightly different topic. I've got something that I wanted to talk about, but I want to talk to you guys about it offline before we dive into it. And then I guess I just want to wrap things up by reminding everybody to go join Andrew's stream, because he's going to be live in 10 minutes. And give him like 3 minutes to eat real quick. And then I'm going to join him over there too and just say hello. And wanted to make sure everybody hits the like button, subscribe, leave a comment, go share stuff, all of that fun stuff. And I also wanted to thank you guys for just coming out here again and talking to everybody and answering all these questions.
Thank you. And waiting for your stream, Andrew, and have fun munching and then streaming.
I know. I'll probably be munching at the beginning, but I'll try to tell a joke or two, too, or at least say something funny.
Will it be coffee or cocktails this time? What are we?
It's too early for cocktails. I'm not actually a lush, even though I've
never too early for cocktails.
That's why the sign is off.
Yeah, it will be coffee today. It will be pizza, water, and coffee.
Yeah, mix in
It-
a little
it's
whiskey
official.
in your coffee.
You need a second sign
Sip it, drink
that
it.
says coffee, and then you can turn it on or off depending on
Coffee
which one.
lounge.
That way, I know for certain what mood we're
Switch
in.
between.
That would actually be. This is too opinionated. This sign.
You need something more generic.
Yeah, I need a generic sign that can easily be switched.
Yep. That's the problem. We'll figure that out.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you again next week. Bye. Now I'm going to play a little video that makes everything disappear. Oh, I was going to, but they're gone. They don't exist anymore now. They got rid of all the videos. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
See ya.